Chapter 37, Two Blows. The two Xiuzhe from Dong Qi sword sect clearly hadn't thought that Sui Mo dared to move first. Especially the one that had moved first. In his perspective, if Tu Ningmai hadn't suddenly appeared in that previous encounter, Sui Mo would have been easily dealt with. This Lianqi trash, he dared to actively provoke the two. The sword energy almost reached the Dong Qi disciple's forehead. The faint cold energy made him abruptly wake up. He instinctively pushed out his flying sword but suddenly remembered that his flying sword had been ruined by this guy in front of him. He didn't manage to dodge in time and got brushed by the faint mist surrounding the sword energy. Hiss! A bloody wound the width of a finger appeared on his forehead. The Dong Qi disciple managed to steady himself, his eyes full of hatred as he stared viciously at Sui Mo, wanting to cut Sui Mo to pieces. This damned guy in front of him. He was clearly only in the stage of Lianqi, but every time they met, he himself would become extremely sorry. Reaching up to touch the wound on his forehead, he saw the blood on his finger. His viciousness rose and he roared angrily, "You want death? If I don't kill you today," taking advantage of the time he took to speak, Sui Mo sent out another blow. The thin sword energy contained a faint mist as it headed for the other's open mouth. This sword energy was even stronger than the one before, the white mist shrouding it even thicker. If one listened carefully, they could almost hear a stream of tinkling as the icicles crashed. The pupils of the Dong Qi disciple that had been spectating from the side suddenly shrunk. Sui Mo had been clever in his timing to send out the sword energy, the speed even faster than before. The other's flying sword had been ruined by Sui Mo. He had actually come today with his Shixiang to help him pick a new flying sword. He hadn't thought he would meet his enemy. When he detected the sword energy, he suddenly realized that it wasn't just his flying sword that had been ruined, but he didn't have any other defensive talisman on his body. Usually, he amused himself by bullying others and neglected his cultivation. Seeing the sword energy coming near, in his panic, he completely didn't know what to do. Pa! The misty sword energy accurately landed on the other's mouth. The blood instantly flew, two teeth landing on the ground. This string of attacks completely stupefied him. He covered his mouth, looking in disbelief at the two teeth on the ground. Sui Mo kept his guard up. Compared to the excitement of the battle last time, he was extremely calm this time. The only thing he could rely on was the gold sword ring. But the gold sword ring could only store 3 sword energies. Sui Mo only had the last sword energy remaining. It was his last and only attack. If the other was only one person, he would unhesitatingly add it on. But he was very clear that the two people's strength were above him, yet he could not just stand by and see Fu Jin be humiliated because of him. The worst case would be getting beaten up viciously. He already prepared to endure it. He wouldn't release this last sword energy easily. He wanted to make it a vicious one. They won't end well. Sui Mo thought viciously. Ah! The other gave a shocking howl, his features twisted and his eyes sprouting fire. The voice once again stopped abruptly. It seemed that an invisible hand was choking his neck. His entire body slowly rose, leaving the ground. Compared to roaring a second ago, he was now like a fish out of the water, eyes bulging, speaking but unable to make any noise. Sui Mo was astounded, his eyes couldn't help looking towards the side. A young person dressed in white slowly moved in their direction. He didn't even look at the Dong Qi disciple hanging in the air. Dong Fu does not allow fighting, don't you all know? The other Dong Qi disciple furrowed his toes. He suddenly raised a hand. A sword energy shot out of his fingertip, stopped and twisted, like drawing a plum branch. The disciple that had been fighting with Sui Mo landed with a plop, face deep purple and unconscious. Sir, you are too biased. Both sides were fighting yet you only blame one person. It isn't fair. The white-clad youth stared at the other, Dong Qizong Mingyan. A little humble name. Didn't think that sir would have heard it. Honored, honored. Zhong Ming Yen raised his hands in a greeting, his expression still cold. Elder Zhua Mei Tian's disciple, it naturally rings in my ears. The white-clad youth said noncommittally. Zhong Ming Yen raised an eyebrow, sir is? You Bai. The white-clad young person gave 2 characters. Oh. Zhong Ming Yen responded faintly, but his voice then turned sharp, so it is the honored disciple of Elder Tian Songzi. However, can brother you tell me, why only punish my sect's disciples? Does brother you discriminate against my Dong Qi disciples? Yu Bai smiled. He pointed with a finger at the jade medal at Zhuo Mo's waist. Only now did Zhong Ming Yen notice the spring sprout jade stick at Zhuo Mo's waist. He blanked for a second before nodding his head. Ling plant farmer, I understand. Giving a deep look to Zhuo Mo, he turned to leave. Yu Bai imperceptibly furrowed his brow. Is sir not taking your shitty with you? Zhong Ming Yen didn't even turn his head, heading forward, leaving behind a sentence. A piece of trash that can't even win over a Lianqi Ling plant farmer, what's the use? Yu Bai shook his head and didn't speak. He casually sent out a stream of white light that entered the sky. Flying sword messages. Compared to little thousand cranes, flying sword messages were much faster. As expected, in a short while, 2 Xiuzhe flew over and landed, bowing to Yu Bai. Yu Bai pointed to the unconscious Dong Qi disciple on the ground, stating, this person broke the prohibitions of Dong Fu, and is now exiled from Dong Fu. Yes. The 2 bowed to Yu Bai and lifted the person with them as they flew away. If I didn't see it wrong, you are the disciple of Wukong Sword Sect's Elder Xin Yen. Yu Bai turned his face and said warmly to Zhua Mo. Zhua Mo shook his head, my master is Shifeng Rong. The time that the other 2 had fought had been very short, but no matter if it was Ling energy or the manipulation of spells, they were hundreds of times better than Zhua Mo. And both of them had vast and intimidating presences. Zhong Ming Yen was cold and sharp, Yu Bai confident and carefree. They were all outstanding. However, Zhua Mo didn't feel very comfortable. No matter if it was Zhong Ming Yen or Yu Bai, their bodies would unconsciously give an aura of being high up. Zhua Mo disliked the aura very much. Unconsciously, he didn't want to have deeper relations with Yu Bai. Elder Shifeng Rong. Yu Bai was slightly surprised at this answer. When the 2 had started to fight, he had already noticed. He hadn't detected anything in the first sword energy but had been shocked that a Ling plant farmer could send out a sword energy. When he noticed the gold sword ring on Zhuo Mo's hand did he understand. At that time, he had prepared to wade in. Tian Yu Jie was a classical minor Jie primarily composed of sword cultivators. Xiuzhe like Ling plant famers were a very rare resource. Not just Dong Fu, but in almost all the primary towns of Tian Yu Jie, there were prohibitions that protected production cultivators like Ling plant farmers. But just at that moment, Zhua Mo sent out the second sword energy. Yu Bai's eyes were very skilled and saw it clearly. The first sword energy only had a little sword energy, not enough to be of significance. But the sword essence in the second sword energy was very similar to Wukong Sword Sect's Ice Dragon Sword, Xin Yan's sword essence. Wukong Sword Sect's sudden rise had attracted everyone's eyes. And as the true ruler of Dongfu, Tian Songzi naturally would pay more attention. Yu Bai was the core disciple of Tian Songzi and he knew much more about Wukong Sword Sect than normal people. The apparition when Wei Xing entered Juji had alerted Tian Songzi. That night, Yu Bai had accompanied his master to investigate. He had personally seen with his own eyes that sword energy that rose into the heavens at Wei Xing's Juji and had never been so shocked. And the scene when Xin Yan's sword had turned into a dragon made his mouth wide and unable to forget. His talents were exceptional and the scope of his eyes far surpassed others in his generation. In the area around Dongfu, the people who could rank with him could be counted on the fingers. But in one night, 2 successive blows, it created a great interest in him to the low-key sect of Wukong sword sect. He couldn't help closely examining Zhuo Mo. From the beginning, the expression on Zhuo Mo's face had never changed. Yu Bai didn't mind that. He had met countless unique individuals. Those that had strength always had some unique qualities. What made him shocked was Zhuo Mo's age and cultivation. It wasn't high, but low. It was very hard to estimate the age of cultivators, but a general decision could be made from the eyes, the manner of speech and conduct. The age of the Wukong sword sect disciple definitely wasn't high. Such an age, it was common to see a cultivation of lianqi. So young, such low cultivation, yet he could comprehend sword essence. This made Yu Bai very surprised. The sword essence carried in the second sword energy had been in a fledgling stage. The white mist surrounding the sword energy easily confused others. That wasn't mist that was caused by the coldness of the sword energy. In reality, it was composed of large numbers of even smaller sword essences. These scattered sword essences were far from complete like Xi and Yan's sword essence, but this lianqi disciple was able to control them in a certain range. That wasn't easy to do. Yu Bai almost couldn't believe it. He always had been confident in his own talents, but seeing this zombie-like disciple, he felt that he didn't know what to say. When he first comprehended sword essence, he had been in the middle stages of Zhuji. He had sat quietly in his master's sword stove for more than 30 days before he had some understandings. Even more, the jade metal of a Ling plant farmer wasn't easy to get. Yu Bai had grown up in Dongfu and knew very well of the difficulty. Another strong entity had come out of Wukong sword sect. Even if his cultivation right now wasn't high, but his future was limitless. Wukong sword sect, already mysterious in Yu Bai's mind, became even more mysterious. Give my greetings to Elder Shi Feng Rong. Yu Bai warmly gave a bow. Noticing the alertness in Zhuo Mo's eyes, he was a proud person, and his desire to form a relationship instantly faded. Dong Fu might protect Ling plant farmers, but you have to be careful and not have bad relationships with others. Finishing, he raised his hands and floated away. Zhuo Mo's heart instantly landed back. He had already prepared to be injured and hadn't thought he would be safe. Even he found it wondrous. Fu Jin wasn't seriously harmed and firmly refused the jingshe that Zhuo Mo handed over. This crisis changed the relationship between the two. Zhuo Mo didn't like Yu Bai but was very happy to interact with Fu Jin. Everyone was little people. Fu Jin was the local snakehead here. He was clear to what each place was selling. In 2 hours, he managed to help Zhuo Mo buy everything he needed. It was a giant bag of a variety of seeds of Ling herbs and grasses. 30 pieces of jingshe were completely spent by Zhuo Mo taking the things he brought. He bid farewell to Fu Jin and sat on the gray-beaked goose straight back to Wukong Mountain. He had decided that he definitely wouldn't leave the mountain before he entered Zhuji. He was still scared about what happened today. He and Dong Qi sword sect were now at odds. If he encountered Dong Qi disciples again, it wouldn't end well for him. To have such good luck as today every time, that was a dream. Dongfu wasn't some safe place. Chapter 38 Fragrant Ginger Yards. What Mo needed to carefully plan out the 20 mu of Ling fields. He had very little money in his hands and couldn't buy many of the Ling herb seeds. Following the conclusions that Elder Wei Nan had made from his experiences, what he picked were species that had a high quality price ratio. To guarantee his profits, Zhuo Mo had attentively researched the present market before taking all his bags with him to the mountain. But he couldn't start seeding it immediately. Up until now, he only had experience planting Ling grains. Any kind of Ling plant had different needs and concerns. Thankfully, Elder Wei Nan had detailed descriptions in the jade sticks and he didn't need to experiment for himself. Studying the jade sticks, laboring over, embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. Other than that, he needed to care for the Ling fields in Cold Mist Valley. He was extremely busy every day, his feet almost not touching the ground. When he had studied pretty much all the jade sticks, he started to prepare the initial work. Luckily, they were all somewhat common ling herbs and grasses and didn't need anything rare or expensive. Otherwise, he could only just stare at it. I'm very poor, I'm very poor, I'm very poor, humming a tune, Swayamo directed the mud-turning earthworm to plow the ling fields and seeded out the ling herbs and grasses he had brought. After a few days, some sprouts had appeared in the 20 mu. The tender greens carried Swayamo's hopes. Swayamo could finally slow down. Even he almost couldn't stand the amount of labor these past days. After planting down all the seeds, the labor required was instantly halved. He finally had the time to cultivate. This was why Sword Shio never liked cultivating any kind of livelihood spell. Practicing any spell required large amounts of time and energy. For sword cultivators, they only focused on the sword. This was enough for them to have unrivaled attack strength. This was also why, in all the shouja, in one-on-one, Sword Shio had the greatest power. Of course, the actual situation would be complicated. There were many factors that could affect the fight between two shouja. It was all tangled and complicated, like cultivation, talismans, seal formations, scriptures etc. Swayamo didn't need to think about these things. At least, before he entered Juji, he didn't need to consider it. For him, what was most important at present was Juji. After that was the 5 basic 5-element spells. This would directly influences how much he would earn. He gave up 10 principal scripture. To try to rely on that to enter Juji, it was a dream. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation became his only choice. He cultivated it as though it was a Ling energy scripture. After Juji, the sect would pass on new scriptures. By then, he would have more choices. This period of time was extremely busy, so busy he forgot the existence of Puyao. It was only now that he suddenly remembered Puyao and decided to take a look in his consciousness. Entering the sea of consciousness, he stared with wide eyes and mouth. Compared to before, the area of his consciousness was several times its previous size. This wasn't surprising to him because his spiritual power had increased greatly. He had already found that whenever his spiritual power increased, the size of his sea of consciousness would increase as well. What shocked him was a river. At some unknown time, a new edition of a river had appeared in his consciousness. A silvery shining river. The surface wasn't broad but it was abnormally straight. It followed the median line of the consciousness and divided the consciousness in two. When Swayamo came near, he was surprised to find that it wasn't water in the river, but countless large and small icicles. The light reflected through the icicles and created the silvery light. And when the countless icicles reflected the light at the same time, the bright light was enough to make the consciousness brighter. They slowly moved up and down like the movement of the tide. Layers of silver light flashed past like a secluded and deeply asleep ice dragon. On the two shores were concentrated red flames. These red flames were like a red water plant that grew beside the rivers. In the sky above his head, that star was even brighter. Neither the roaring flames nor the shining ice river could block its light. In the sea of flames, on the edge of the river, under the star, a gravestone was shrouded in black clouds and Puyao sat silently on it, listening to the sound tablet. Swayamo was completely stunned by the scene. The sea of consciousness was very calm, only the sound of the sound tablet drifting. The dark red flames danced, like the most seductive dancers twisting their waists. The slowly flowing ice river was like a sword, cold and awe-inspiring. The star was mysterious and profound. All of this created an extremely harmonious picture, and gave him a peerless shock. A beat later, Swayamo's mind refocused. He still wasn't clear what the sea of flames and the star was, but this ice river was like the tidal icicle sword essence that he had comprehended. About this point, he was very certain. Because from what he saw, flowing in the river wasn't icicles but countless sword essences. This ice river would have formed exactly in this period of time. He felt that there was some faint connection, but no matter how hard he thought, he couldn't catch it. The flames and the star had appeared very early. They must be related to embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. The time that the star appeared was when he had completed one breath. Did it represent one breath? What about the red flames? He wanted to ask Pu Yao, but he also knew that Pu Yao definitely wouldn't answer. Oh, of course, if there was Jingshi, that was a whole different matter. Zuemo didn't disturb Pu Yao and left the consciousness. When Zuemo disappeared from the consciousness, Pu Yao opened his eye. In his blood-red eye was panic. Even though he was at the 9th level of Lianqi, but there was still a distance before reaching Zhuji. The amount of Ling energy needed for Lianqi 9th level was much greater than the previous levels. Zuemo wasn't impatient. With the help of a high-grade Ling vein, if he still couldn't enter Zhuji, he didn't need to cultivate anymore. He could feel that the increase in his Ling energy was very fast. The fire dragon grass had been moved into Zuemo's own fields. The sunlight in West Wind Valley was abundant and more suitable to the growth of the fire dragon grass. Just like normal, Zuemo stood in front of the fire dragon grass. He cycled his Ling energy, his two hands moving quickly. It was Art of Crimson Flame. After practicing finger movements in the water, the nimbleness of his pair of hands were much stronger than before. The Art of Crimson Flame, with its simpler hand movements, was much easier for him to cast. A thin faint gold light dropped from the sky, passed those Zuemo's hands and was guided onto the fire dragon grass. Art of Crimson Flame could concentrate the essence of pure yang. It was very beneficial to plants that were young. Zuemo didn't move, appearing like a stone person. The crucial factors of Art of Crimson Flame were endurance and a peaceful mind. This wasn't a problem for Zuemo. After receiving the jade medal, he found that he had walked an indirect road. If he had picked Art of Crimson Flame in the beginning, he would have gotten the jade medal earlier. However, there wasn't a deficiency that was for nothing. Since he could do Art of Flora, the most difficult of the 5 spells, the other spells were easily achieved. Time passed little by little. The strand of pale gold light that came from the sky turned slightly darker. A layer of light gold appeared on Zuemo's hands as though gold was plated onto them. The leaves of the fire dragon grass became even brighter and fresher, vitality pouring from the entire plant. After persisting for an hour, he finally stopped. His 2 hands moved and that thin gold strand instantly disappeared. He inspected the fire dragon grass and was very satisfied. Art of Crimson Flame was extremely good for young plants. All plants were divided into yin or yang. Zuemo also divided his own Ling fields into 2. The parts with more sunlight, he used to plant young plants. The parts that were shadier and had more moisture, he used to grow yin plants. Zuemo prepared to cast Art of Earth Energy. Each day, he would cast a variety of spells on these plants. This was a duty that he had to complete every day. He didn't know if it was that he had used it too much, but Art of Crimson Flame and Art of Earth Energy quickly entered the 3rd level without any of the difficulty that came with the breakthroughs of the other 3 spells. Afterwards, he had thought and then understood. Most of the credit had to go to embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. His spirit was much stronger than before. And no matter if it was the calm mind of Art of Crimson Flame, or the communication and perception of Art of Earth Energy, it was all tightly linked to the spirit. Suddenly a purple light landed beside his hand from the sky. A purple flying sword the length of his middle finger suddenly appeared next to his hand. Flying sword message. Zuemo turned to look around. Seeing that no one else was around, he then was certain it was for him. He carefully reached for the flying sword. The moment his finger touched the flying sword, a voice sounded inside his mind. Come to Fragrant Ginger Yard at 3. It was his master Shifeng Rong's voice. Mo's heart calmed down. Previously, he had been tortured to death by that pink paper crane and he had finally received a break. The pitiful Mo, his nerves had become very fragile and suspicious of these kinds of things. These last few days, his master hadn't sought him out. It must have been given him time to get settled. Mo was very excited. Master's proficiency in the area of dan making was very deep, and according to Liang Feng Shiji, the dan that master made, it was always easy to sell. In the previous times that master had spent traveling outside, the income of the sect had been significantly impacted. And according to the experiences of Elder Wei Nan recorded in the Jade Stick, making dan was a faster way to make jingsher than farming. Exactly at 3, Mo arrived at Fragrant Ginger Yard. This was the first time he had come to Fragrant Ginger Yard. Entering the gate, he saw many female disciples at work. Some were drying ling herbs, some were sorting, others had ling energy on their hands as they ground up ling herbs. In this large yard, there were more than 40 female disciples at work. Seeing Mo, all these female disciples all stopped what they were doing. Shi Xiang. Shi Xiang. They all bowed in greeting and surreptitiously examined this Shi Xiang. The news that 4th Shirgu had received a male disciple had spread through Fragrant Ginger Yard very early on. This crowd of female disciples already had a good handle on Mo's background. What made them feel comforted was that Mo had once helped the female disciples at the eastern peak that were responsible for the animals and wasn't one to harass others. They were all outer sect female disciples, and couldn't really count as Shifeng Rong's disciples. Compared to Mo, their status was very far off and didn't dare offend him. Mo frantically gave a bow in return. Seeing Mo's embarrassed state, laughter sounded among the female disciples. The front female disciple instantly turned her head, looking in dissatisfaction at the female disciples who were laughing. The laughter instantly stopped. "Come in." Master's voice came from the inner yard, coincidentally releasing Mo from his predicament. He fled away. Chapter 39, Starting Making Dan. From today onwards, you will learn how to make Dan with me. The job this month is very simple. 5 fasting pills, doesn't matter what grade they are. Give them to me by the end of the month, Shifeng Rong coldly said. I have prepared 10 portions of ingredients for you. If there isn't enough, buy more yourself. The method to make fasting pills is in the study. You can read all the jade sticks in the study. Those that are over your cultivation, you won't be able to see. Everything is in the room in the west wing. In the future, that would be your Dan making room. Alright, you can go. Finishing, Shifeng Rong turned and entered her Dan making room. With a bang, the Dan room was shut tightly. Mo dumbly stood. This was called learning Dan making with his master. He turned to look at the surroundings. Empty. Not a single person. Mo grimaced. Why did he only ever encounter these kind of people? It was like this when he learned things from Pu Yao, there were never any explanations. And this master was even more extreme. Not just throwing him to the side, she also stipulated how much he had to make. When Mo went into the study, he stared dumbly. How to find the recipe? In the study, there floated hundreds of jade sticks in different shapes and colors. They were like a group of mischievous children, drifting to and fro in the study. There was an energy whirlpool of various colors around each jade stick. It was these whirlpools that carried the jade sticks in flight. Fasting pill. After musing for a long moment, Mo shouted helplessly. The jade sticks unconcernedly floated about, not responding. That way wasn't right. But there wasn't anything else in the room. Mo scratched hard at his head, he was at his wit's end. Maybe he needed to use his consciousness. After hesitating for a while, he reached out with his consciousness. When his consciousness touched the energy whirlpool around a jade stick, something instantly flooded into his head. Energy Diagrams of Ling Herbs. Authored by Dongming Sanren, I, of Little Lingjia. Includes more than 400 Ling herb energy diagrams. Zhuo Mo's mind instantly jumped, his consciousness going to touch all the other jade sticks. The information from each jade stick was released inside his mind. Very quickly, he found inside one jade stick the method to make fasting pills. This jade stick had, in total, the recipe for 3 different basic dan. Fasting pill was the most basic dan. Its use was very simple, to satisfy hunger. Using it would guarantee a long time without hunger. It counted as a type of useful dan. His consciousness locked onto this jade stick and the jade stick automatically flew in front of him. Picking up the jade stick, he poured Ling energy in and the recipe to make fasting pills was revealed in his mind. And then, the pitiful Zhuo Mo could only stare dumbly again. Monarch Pakima leaves, subject yellow stone, 3x3 flowing fire, cauldron energy sinking to bottom. Zhuo Mo recognized every character. However, if he put the characters together, it was like he was in a thick mist, completely lost. Calm, he had to be calm. Zhuo Mo furiously told his frantic self. He had always assumed that when he became an inner sect disciple, it meant that his hard days had come to an end and his good days were coming. But now he knew, he was wrong, extremely wrong. He had only jumped from one hole to an even deeper hole. He wanted to cry because he had willingly jumped, tried everything to jump in. He had thought his previous days were hard because no one was there to guide him. But now that he became an inner sect disciple, had a master, what was the difference? After a long moment and then his emotions steadied. He was completely disregarded by his master. Zhuo Mo's stubbornness came on. Wasn't it just a fasting pill? Wasn't it just making dan? Wasn't it just not being taught? After half a day's worth of effort, he had read every single jade stick in the room. The total amount was 517 jade sticks. And what he could see were only 21 of them. The 21 jade sticks that he had picked out were all floating in front of him. Fire Cloud Dan chapter, not what he wanted, thrown to one side. Blue Ice Dan chapter, no, thrown to one side. Vaporized Dan chapter, thrown. Only when he saw, basics of making dan, did Zhuo Mo's mind become alert. He grabbed it and brought it over. This was what he wanted. As though he was starving, he read, Basics of Making Dan. He quickly became enraptured. The contents inside the jade stick were extremely new to him, a completely new world for him to explore. There weren't any complex contents inside, Basics of Making Dan. Everything was some of the basic fundamentals of making dan, like the matching of herbs, the usage of the cauldron, how to control the fire etc. etc. When he raised his head, he saw that the sky had darkened. Unknowingly, he had stayed for a number of hours in the study. Exhaling a breath, he stood up and moved his sore neck and legs. His eyes were still slightly dull. He was still thinking. Basics of Making Dan wasn't a high-grade jade stick, but the details of the contents weren't anything that could be brought on the market. Having the experiences of being an outer sect disciple, Zhuo Mo deeply understood the value in this opportunity. As to whether his master would teach him, it had been thrown to the back of his head. It was like he had found treasure as he repeatedly started to read again. The following days, he spent soaking in knowledge at the study. Any jade stick that he could read, he didn't miss a single one of them. They might be useful in the future. Putting in some effort now, he didn't need to worry in the future. If he converted these jade sticks into Jingshi, it was enough to buy 10 Zhuo Mo. If there was one day when he was in poverty, he could sell the contents of the jade sticks for Jingshi. In the study, Zhuo Mo snickered. After memorizing the jade sticks until he was dizzy, Zhuo Mo finally managed to remember the entire contents of the 21 jade sticks. Only now did he remember the Dan room in the right wing was going to be for him and excitedly ran into the right wing. What was most eye-catching in the room was a copper cauldron in the middle of the room. About 2 people tall, 3 round bellies protruding out, and several mats laid around it. There were a few tables against the wall with things piled up on it. The 10 portions of materials that Master had prepared for him were also there. Suemo circled around the dan-making cauldron, muttering, "So stingy. Don't just look at the size of the thing, but in reality, it was only a first-grade cauldron." The most important part of a cauldron was the Li-2 fire seal formation. Beside the body of the cauldron, there was a yin-yang 8 trigrams plate. Pouring Ling energy in that could control the Li fire seal formation. Controlling the fire was the most important step in the process of making Dan. Like the 3x3 of flowing fire. 3x3 meant vertical 3, horizontal 3, and flowing fire was a very special kind of fire. Its main flame would roll along the channels. Suemo put his hands on the 8 trigrams plate and added Ling energy. As expected, a ball of fire lit up at the bottom of the cauldron. According to the method recorded in Basics of Making Dan, he carefully controlled the Li fire seal formation. The Li fire seal formation in a first-grade cauldron wasn't some high-end thing and only had 6 transformations. Suemo quickly familiarized himself with the process. As he played around with the flame, Suemo suddenly felt that the feeling of controlling fire was very similar to him casting Art of Crimson Flame. The 5 basic spells of a Ling plant farmer belonged to the 5 elements and yin-yang. Supposedly, Ling plant farmers believed that all things in the world were either yin or yang and belonged to the 5 elements. Art of Crimson Flame belonged to fire in the 5 basic element spells. Speaking from that perspective, the two were connected. However, while the 5 elements and yin-yang had once been a popular path, but as sword cultivators rose, they gradually became a separate system and most practitioners were roaming cultivators. Whether making Dan had similarities to Ling plant farmers, Suemo wasn't clear. But, if sword essence could merge with Art of Aged Gold, he wouldn't be surprised at a connection between controlling fire and Art of Crimson Flame. The Art of Crimson Flame that he had brought was very rough. Learning it to the 3rd level was already at the extreme limit. There were no instructions for anything further. What he could study were only the first 3 levels. Closing his eyes, his 2 hands were spread on the 8 trigrams plate on the wall of the cauldron. He carefully experienced the subtle aspects of the Li fire seal formation. After a long time, he didn't have any breakthroughs. He had the feeling that those 2 could be combined together, but no matter how he changed it, there was no reaction. With no other solution, he temporarily put the thought to the side. In the area of Dan making, he was the greenest of the green. It was too early to start discussing inventions. He should obediently make the fasting pills. Otherwise, if he couldn't give out 5 at the end of the month, he didn't know how his cold-faced master would punish him. The method for making fasting pills, he remembered it, but what he was lacking was actual experience. There were 10 portions of materials piled on the table. They had all been treated. One of the jobs of the female disciples in the yard was to simply treat all kinds of medicines. Fasting pills were the most basic Dan and naturally didn't have very complicated preparations. Carefully putting each type of material in the cauldron according to the ratio, Suemo sat down facing the cauldron. He sorted out his mind, his 2 hands on the 8 trigrams, and sent Ling energy in. A light red light came out of the bottom of the cauldron. Suemo carefully and nervously manipulated the Ling energy. 2 hours passed. A fine layer of sweat appeared on Suemo's forehead. He felt it was becoming difficult. It was extremely laborious to continuously input in Ling energy steadily for a long time. Damn it! 2 hours had passed, but the ingredients had just seemed to start combining together. Based on the progress, if it didn't take a few hours, he guessed it was hopeless. Thinking that he had to continue to maintain this level of Ling energy for long hours, Suemo felt that it was going to be trouble. After another 2 hours, sweat poured down his back. Suddenly, his Ling energy became unstable. Poof! A black wisp of smoke came out of the cauldron. A burnt smell filled the room. Huff, huff, huff. Having no time to be angry, Zhuo took back his Ling energy and sat on the floor as he panted. His entire body was soaked in sweat. One factor was exhaustion from long-term Ling energy output, another was that he was very close to the cauldron. The fire inside the cauldron cooked him like a cooked shrimp, body completely red. He didn't immediately start making Dan a second time. He struggled up and climbed onto the gray-beaked goose to return to West Wind Valley. It was lucky that he was an inner sect disciple and could ride a steed inside the mountain. He hadn't felt it a moment ago, but lying on the back of the gray-beaked goose, he felt weak all over, not willing to raise even a finger. He had never felt such deep exhaustion like today. Fighting was gathering up all the strength in the body at one and making Dan was like spinning silk from cocoons. Bit by bit, until it wrung out the last bit of Ling energy from the body. Even if his Ling energy wasn't weak now, but facing such intense Ling energy output, he couldn't bear it. And if he was the slightest bit inattentiveness, all the effort before were completely ruined. Zhuo sighed in grief inside. From his perspective, as expected, any method that easily earned Jingshi, none of them were simple. Jingshi wasn't easy to earn. Title for a roaming show. One of the 8 trigrams, Li represents fire. Chapter 48. On top of the mat inside the stone room, Zhuo serenely mediated, motionless. Through the 24th point of the governing, the 17th point of the conception and the 1st point of the kidney vessels, thick Ling energy entered his body. It especially entered from the governing vessel point. When the Ling energy entered, it had a slightly cool feeling, extremely pleasant. After Zhuo had completed one breath, his breathing through the mouth and nose was much less important. Right now, he had only opened 3 points. If he could reach 10 breaths, not only just all 361 points would be opened, all the pores in his body would be unblocked and he would breathe with the world. Of course, for him at the moment, that was very far away. His consciousness had increased, but up until now, he hadn't found any uses for spiritual power. What he needed now was Ling energy, continuous accumulating Ling energy in hopes of entering Zhuji soon. When he woke up from the mediation, Zhuo's breath shot out like an arrow. How was Shixiang doing in the sword cave? The thought popped suddenly into Zhuo's mind. In reality, he was very envious about the road that Shixiang had picked. It only needed to pay attention to one matter. However, he was clear enough to realize that Shixiang's road wasn't suited for him. So he might be envious, but he would keep doing what he needed to do. He always felt that he didn't have too much talent in the area of the sword. If it wasn't for Pu Yao's existence, not just getting a sword essence, but it was impossible to do what Shixiang was doing. His talents laid in the 5 elements. Other than Art of Aged Gold, which had been helped by Pu Yao, he had learned the other 4 spells on his own. So he was more enthusiastic about 5 element spells. Sometimes he would think, had he once been a roaming shou before? Only roaming shou liked 5 element spells. However, even if he had been a roaming shou, he must have been a silent and unknown shou living in the lowest classes. But if that was the case, why was his appearance changed and mind erased? He unconsciously tightened his fist. Carefully retreating out of the stone cavern, he walked to the opening. The sunlight outside made his eyes squint. The warm sunlight made Zhuo's mood unintentionally better. Walking to the Ling fields and seeing the vigorous Ling herbs, his mood became even better. A Ling plant farmer was the profession that was the easiest at showing the relationship between work and result. When you paid in effort and worked hard, the joy at the bountiful harvest made life seem full of hope. Even Old Black, who had a harsh life, smiled when it was harvest time. Zhuo calculated the time in his mind. The new cycle of Ling grains should be starting soon. His previous yard had been yielded to Old Black. Old Black had been yearning for that 5 mu of Ling fields for a long time. If it hadn't been for Old Black, he wouldn't have been introduced to Wei Xingxixiang. With that connection there, his friendship with Old Black was naturally different. With nothing to do, Zhuemo thought to go see him. However, he didn't find anyone at the yard. Zhuemo guessed that Old Black had gone to the Ling fields and headed to the fields. As expected, he found Old Black in the fields. Also there was Guolu. However, the former Guolu Shixiang was now the present Guolu Shidi. That made him slightly unaccustomed. No matter the age or cultivation, outer sect disciples had to call inner sect disciples Shixiang or Shiji. This was the same in every sect. Old Black saw Zhuemo and made a happy expression, little Mo go. It seemed that Guolu's illness had healed. He wasn't familiar with Zhuemo and reservedly gave a bow, Zhua Shixiang. Zhuemo felt extremely awkward being called Shixiang by two people whose ages far surpassed him. Thankfully, his face was frozen and nothing could be detected. Old Black's Ling grains are really well grown. Zhuemo scanned the Ling fields and couldn't resist praising it. He calmly started a spell, instantly a ball of clouds floated over and the silver strands poured down continuously. Old Black instantly revealed a happy expression. Admiration appeared on Guolu's face. The fourth level of Little Art of Cloud and Rain, people rarely reached it. Guolu had been recovering on the sickbed in the previous months, but the big events that happened in the sect, he had heard them from Old Black. In 1 year, 3 outer sect disciples became inner sect disciples. The sect had never been so flourishing. All the outer sect disciples were greatly encouraged and many of them became even more hard-working. Guolu attentively examined this young Shixiang. Little Zhuemo Shixiang was the inner sect disciple with the lowest cultivation in the sect, a Yanqi disciple that hadn't entered Juji. But the genius of the little Shixiang had passed on. To be able to receive a spring sprout jade medal in Lianqi, Guolu had never heard of it. His best was Art of Aged Gold. He had worked hard these years but never could break through to the 3rd level. Looking at the little Shixiang who had already become a Ling plant farmer, his heart couldn't help moving. Thinking about it, he couldn't help but be envious of Old Black. No matter if it was Wei Xingxixiang or Zhuemo Shixiang, they all had good relationships with Old Black. The waters rose and the boat became high. Old Black was now extremely popular in the outer sect disciples. But Old Black was very down to earth and still planted his Ling grains. Because Guolu had been wounded last time when he had helped Old Black, and Old Black had taken care of him in the recovery, the two had a great relationship. This is 2 mud-turning earthworms. It doesn't have a great use, but it is useful in plowing fields. Zhuemo handed both of them each a small bamboo tube. Sealed inside each tube was a mud-turning earthworm. He hadn't thought that Guolu would be present, but he had enough mud-turning earthworms. The two hurriedly gave their thanks. Guolu saw Zhuemo moving to leave and after struggling and hesitating for a second, he couldn't resist speaking and at the very end, little Shixiang, my Art of Aged Gold, has been stuck at the 2nd level. Please, Shixiang, give some advice. Guoluo would be deeply grateful. Zhuemo was astounded but still stopped in his footsteps. He was respectful of this old farmer like Shixiang who had stood up last time. Right now, his income didn't depend on things like making rain, so the two naturally didn't have any conflicts in interest. Quite the opposite. If Guolu could break into the 3rd level of Art of Aged Gold, he could take on much of the pest problems in the sect for him. Thinking through all the possibilities, he decided to help Guolu. Killing worms is still killing. Gold's main purpose is to kill. This, Art of Aged Gold, belongs to the path of killing. How to kill? There are countless ways in this area. Adding on aged gold energy can transform in many ways. If other methods of killing could be added in, the matter is half solved already. Guolu listened attentively, afraid of losing even a word. When Zhuemo finished, he was pinned to his spot, face deep in thought. Seeing the situation, Zhuo Mo floated away. Leaving behind the Ling fields, he headed for the eastern peak. The recent changes made him felt that it was a different lifetime. The female disciples of the eastern peak had meant to rely on him, but who would have thought he would become an inner sect disciple? Usually, he wouldn't be able to care for them anymore. But since he received benefits from them, that the black gold worm had been their present, Zhuo Mo decided to help them. When Xiaoguo saw Zhuo Mo, a surprised expression came onto her round apple face. She timidly said, "Shi Xiang." The gold-horned copper cow was still leisurely eating ling grass, not paying any attention to Zhuo Mo. Zhuo Mo felt slightly helpless towards this little girl, especially the always timid expression on her face. Last time when he had fainted, the little girl had been afraid but still persisted in protecting him. When he had heard of this from the others, he was very moved and felt that he owed her a favor. "What? Unhappy to see me?" Zhuo Mo decided to tease the little girl. His face didn't have any expression in the first place. Adding on a slightly stern tone, it was quite frightening. Xiaoguo instantly was frightened, her small head furiously shaking, mist rising in her large yes, her mouth hurriedly explaining, "No, no." Zhuo Mo instantly realized if he continued, she would really cry. He instantly regretted his action. Wasn't this making trouble for himself? He hurriedly relaxed his tone, "All right. Coming this time, there's something to give to you." The mist in Xiaoguo's eyes instantly stopped. She looked in puzzlement at Zhuo Mo and asked timidly, "What thing?" "Shi Xiang. This is some sword scriptures, you take it and practice and can pass it on to your other Shiji and Shimi." He handed 2 jade sticks over to the little girl. One of the sticks stored some basic sword moves that he had picked out from the jade stick that Wei Xing Shixiang had given him. At the same time, he took off the gold sword ring from his hand and handed that as well to her. "This is gold sword ring. It can store 3 sword energies. But you first need to learn a gold spell. And, one of the jade sticks has 5 element spells inside. After practicing the art of aged gold, for a while, you can use this talisman." After explaining all this, Zhuo Mo released a breath. This muddle-headed little girl always made his head hurt. The gold sword ring was not of great use to him now. And he had decided that before Zhuji, he definitely wouldn't leave the mountain. After Zhuji, if Master didn't give a flying sword, he could use ice crystal sword. The power would be much greater than gold sword ring. And that jade stick that contained the 5 element spells wasn't useful for him anymore. He hadn't thought of giving Xiaoguo that jade stick at first, but if she didn't cultivate a gold-attributed spell, it wasn't possible to use the gold sword ring. As though the simple sword moves in Wei Xing Shixiang's jade stick. They were simple but useful. For Lianqi disciples, they were a pretty good method of protection. Female disciples, especially weaker outer sect female disciples, their circumstances would be harder than male disciples. Zhuo Mo could not spare the attention to take care of them like before, and decided to pass these things on to them. In this case, if they met some Xiuzhe who wasn't too powerful, it wasn't as though they couldn't even counterattack. If they met a strong one, he had no solution neither. Luckily, the Dong Qi sword sect disciple from last time had been expelled from Dong Fu. He didn't need to worry about encountering that guy nearby. After handing over everything, Zhuo Mo flipped up and landed onto the gray-beaked goose's back. He waved his hand at Xiaoguo without turning his head back and floated off. Looking at the disappearing Zhuo Mo, Xiaoguo's hands as they held the gold sword ring and the jade sticks unconsciously tightened. Finishing all this, Zhuo Mo felt that his body was much more relaxed and headed straight for fragrant ginger yard. He still needed to present 5 fasting pills at the end of the month. He didn't dare to offend his cold-faced master. If he didn't complete it, he would certain receive punishment. Entering the Dan room, he didn't start moving immediately. The materials were limited. If he really ruined all of the materials, in his penniless state, there was no place for him to buy more. In theory, with his present cultivation, making fasting pills shouldn't be hard. It really was the most basic Dan. Thinking for a long time, he felt that last time it was that he hadn't controlled the input of Ling energy properly and wasted a lot of Ling energy, causing his Ling energy to not be enough. After thinking for a long time repeatedly and entering mediation, he let the Ling energy recover to the best state. Then he started his second try. Chapter 41, Spiritual Power Bang. The smell of burnt materials once again rose out of the cauldron, spreading through the room. Suemo gasped heavily, sweat running down his face like a stream. The second try was still a failure. This time, he had continued for 6 hours, but still failed. Opening the cauldron and looking at the black remnants inside, Suemo's mood was terrible. He was as tired as a dead dog right now and could only stare. He had always thought Dan making was a technical job, not a strength job. If even the fasting pills were this hard, then those high-grade Dan, wouldn't he kill himself in the process? He had a deeper understanding in the second try than the first. His previous deductions were not wrong. He was still too new to Dan making. In the process of adding Ling energy, he would waste too much Ling energy. If his cultivation was at Juji, this fasting pill wouldn't be hard. There would be plenty of excess Ling energy to waste, but to a Lianqi 9th level, just the slightest mistake and the Ling energy wouldn't be enough. According to the method on the jade stick, the entire process only needed 10 hours. That meant that he had to make it through 10 hours at minimum. The difference between that and the present 6 hours was very large. Even though there was the Ling vein in the stone room, but increases in Ling energy was a slow process. It seemed he could only try to work on controlling Ling energy. After a while, Suemo's breaths gradually steadied and his mind returned to clarity. He thought carefully. He wasn't weak in the area of controlling Ling energy. Little art of cloud and rain required a strong control of Ling energy. Even though he had strangely made his way onto the 4th level, but in the matter of controlling Ling energy, theoretically it shouldn't be a big problem. Mulling over it, Suemo felt that he was still too unfamiliar with Dan making. If he had to familiarize himself, then how much material would that take? The 10 portions that he had, he didn't even know if it could last him until he was familiar. He most likely wouldn't be able to fulfill the quota of 5 fasting pills by the end of the month. Supposedly, when the heads took on new subordinates, they would always make a show of strength at the first interaction. Oh, was this the show of strength of his cold-faced master? He thought humorously. Returning to the little West Wind yard, he wasn't in the mood to eat. After meditation and recovering Ling energy, he climbed onto the roof and continued to ponder the intricacies of Dan making. The moonlight flowed down like the water, gently illuminating the mountain valley. Beside Suemo, the gray-beaked goose silently stood on the roof. Beside Suemo's feet, the black gold worm climbed around. After reaching the 4th grade, its intelligence had greatly increased and it constantly followed Suemo around. Suddenly, Suemo felt something was flying close. He couldn't help raising his head and looked at the mouth of the valley. A pink little thousand crane spiraled down in the night. Suemo instantly recovered from his shock at the top of the roof. He felt his skin prickle. Dan making was tossed far away. There was only one thought in his mind. Damn it, why did this cursed woman come again? Just like last time, the pink paper crane elegantly unfolded in front of Suemo. Ye, have you missed me? He, I've missed ye. Looking at the paper floating in front of him, Suemo had a strong impulse to kick it down Wukong Mountain. Calm, he needed to be calm. Suppressing the devious impulse inside, Suemo spat out a stream of malicious swears in discontent. Damned woman. You won't die well. You're just bored and have nothing to do. You mental case, swearing for 10 minutes, Suemo swore so much his throat was dry. The irritation in his heart decreased slightly. Looking at the pink paper that was still floating in place before him, Suemo, who had a moment ago been full of righteous indignation, instantly became dejected. In helplessness, he grabbed the pink paper and jumped down off the roof. Finding a weasel bristle brush, he dipped it in cinnabar. What is it? After throwing the brush to one side, Suemo messily folded the paper into a crane and threw it out the window. Even though he got rid of the crane, Suemo still felt depressed. He really had no solution against the owner of the paper crane. He had never thought someone would be bored to such a degree. This bored crazy woman. But her power was much stronger than him. Just any discomfort and the other would straightforwardly use brute force to suppress it. When GE becomes strong, see how GE will sort you out. Suemo bared his teeth. Very quickly, another pink paper crane flew over. Don't be like this to me. I'm very hurt. Yi, what have you been doing recently? What a waste of words. Suemo crisply made an evaluation but still grudgingly picked up the brush. Making Dan. West Wind Valley, the paper cranes flew in and out. Ah, Dan making. That's fun. I've never played it before. I only know how to fold paper cranes. You only know how to fold cranes. When Suemo saw the words, his face instantly became black. He wrote back with the brush, wrong, you also can draw flame exploding seals. Hee, I'm really not that good at flame exploding seals. What I'm best at is a 36 chain flame exploding seal. Threats, menace. This definitely was a threat. Suemo's fist cracked as it tightened. From his teeth, he forced out, "Gu will endure." The reality was cruel. Under the threat of the other's 36 chain flame exploding seal, Suemo could only swallow his anger and keep writing. Have to be a lady. A female, fighting and killing isn't good. But I'm very much a lady. I just like watching fireworks. My goal is 108 chain. Fireworks. Suemo felt depressed. His fragile spirit was viciously struck again. The whole night, Suemo basically had no time to think about Dan making. The pink paper cranes were like a relentless nightmare, forcing Suemo to keep writing. Only when the sky lightened was he, under the others, I'm going to be freed. Suemo had been tormented to crippleness. He felt that it was even more tiring to reply to letters the whole night than making Dan the whole night. Bending to scoop some cold water, he washed his face. Then he came to the Ling fields. Different compared to the other spells, making rain was almost required every day. In a state of muddle-headedness, he casted, Little Art of Cloud and Rain. The sounds of water falling started. His mind was floating far away. Little Art of Cloud and Rain was his most familiar spell. Even if he closed his eyes, he could still cast it. The Ling energy gathered at both of his hands. There was a connection between the ball of clouds and his two hands. The rain was very steady and continuous. He instinctively adjusted the Ling energy. He was too familiar with the spell. He didn't need to add Ling energy at every single spot. Wait. Suemo was startled out of his daze. He realized he had a very important discovery. He didn't need to add Ling energy to every location. He indistinctly felt that he found the crucial point and didn't dare to ignore it. He hurried and continued to think. Little Art of Cloud and Rain was his most skilled and most familiar spell. He was extremely familiar with every segment. He thought carefully. From starting with the finger motions of Little Art of Cloud and Rain, to concentrating the clouds, to the fall of rain, the amount of Ling energy for each step was different. Some parts, like the rain falling, it almost didn't need any Ling energy at all, just guidance. As he thought even further, Suemo became excited, his drowsiness fading. If the process of Dan making was like casting a spell, then it should also have places that wouldn't consume Ling energy. As he mused to himself, Suemo felt that it was very rational and also felt that his actions of putting in a continuous flow of Ling energy was very stupid. Understanding the direction, Then the next step was to find where in the process needed Ling energy, and what times could Ling energy be saved. This question sent him back into deep thought. He was very familiar with little art of cloud and rain, so he could find what places needed or didn't need Ling energy. However, he was unfamiliar with dam making. To find the ways to save up Ling energy, he needed to become familiar with the entire process. Yet to familiarizing himself with the entire process, that meant using up large amounts of materials. Unfortunately, he didn't have any jingsher left. The stone-faced Mo grimaced inside. The question was once again difficult. Was the only way increasing Ling energy? That wasn't realistic. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation was only a scripture for increasing spiritual power. Suddenly, his heart jumped. Spiritual power, maybe he could try with spiritual power. As his mind increased in strength, his greatest change was becoming much more sensitive to everything in the surroundings. Like some of the high-level Jinji. Before, when he passed them, he wouldn't feel anything. But now he could detect the strong killing intent and danger embodied in them. How to use his consciousness was a question he had been puzzled by. Other than art of aged gold, he had no knowledge of how to use his consciousness. What, embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, cultivated was the spirit. The increase in the Ling energy was just a side effect. After he cultivated embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, the increase in his spirit far surpassed his progress in Ling energy. Maybe he should think about how to use the consciousness. Mo felt that this might be the breakthrough point. Mo spent the whole day casting the 5 spells in the Ling fields. But today, he didn't focus on casting the spells, but rather on using the consciousness to detect the entire process of casting. This method was extremely effective. Mo was pleasantly surprised by his results. Each step, the change in flow of Ling energy each time, under the scan of the consciousness, it became clear as it never had been before. He could even feel the hair-thin Ling energy flowing. It seemed that he had a treasure mountain but didn't know. Mo was irritated. If he had known earlier to use the consciousness, his spells might have entered the 3rd level much earlier. The soul was peaceful, untainted, and serene. Under the guidance of his consciousness, he focused on making slight changes to each spell. He didn't let go of any change in the Ling energy. How to increase the effect, how to save on Ling energy, how to make it flow. He was like a stone mason, slowly performing changes on his work, slowly experimenting. He didn't know that in his sea of consciousness, the star became brighter than it had ever been, standing out in the darkness. The dancing red sea of flames was strangely quiet and motionless. Only the ice river was slowly flowing, unaffected. On the gravestone shrouded in black clouds, Puyao raised his head. The corner of his mouth rose, cold like a blade. This is the person you chose. Looking at it now, your eyes are still this crappy. He closed his blood eye again, entering meditation. Chapter 42 Dan completed. Mo held the fasting pill in front of him, his eyes filled with joy. This was his 4th try and he finally succeeded. The fasting pill was the size of a longan fruit, its color was an attractive blue-green, with a delicate fragrance being emitted. Just a look make one unable to resist wanting to eat it. Fasting pills were mostly prepared for those cultivators who were in seclusion and who had the money. He didn't immediately start making a second one. The success of this fasting pill meant that his direction was correct. With that in the front, what he needed to think about now was the success rate. There were only 6 portions of ingredients left. At the very least, he needed to make 4 fasting pills. In other words, he could only fail 2 more times. In reality, on the 3rd try, he had almost succeeded. However, he slipped up at a small place and everything failed. His consciousness could help him detect the changes of the herbs inside the cauldron and he could accordingly adjust his Ling energy. Spiritual power was really a good thing. Mo thought blissfully. Other than Dan making, after he swept over the other spells with his consciousness and made adjustments, not only did his consumption of Ling energy go down, the effects also greatly improved. He did have a few fractions of self-awareness. Even though spiritual power was amazing, but his own experience and knowledge was extremely limited. Even with the help of his spiritual power, the changes he could make were limited. But even those minor changes were very effective. He mused that he should go to the records of the sect to take a look and see if he could find any jade sticks about this area. He was an inner sect disciple now, it would be dumb if he didn't seek out some benefits for himself. Ending up with a cold-faced master who couldn't be relied upon. It was more realistic to rely on himself. Sword cultivators might prioritize Ling energy and not spiritual power, but Sui-Mo believed what Wukong's sword sect had accumulated over the years definitely surpassed his aimless fumbles. Of course, that was for the future. Right now, he had many things to work on. Other than dam making, taking care of the Ling fields was also an important job. Even more, for him who had no money at the moment, earning Jingxi was the question he must consider at the present. It had been a while since those Ling grass and herbs had been planted. Some were nearing the harvest time. How to sell them off was also a headache for him. Before he entered Juji, he didn't want to go outside the gates of the mountain. Suddenly remembering Master had said if he didn't have enough materials, he had to use his own Jingxi to buy. Did that mean that the sect's materials could be brought? Then did that mean he could sell them? Sui-Mo walked out of his Dan room. In the yard, a crowd of female disciples worked hard at preparing all kinds of herbs. Scanning around, Sui-Mo's gaze landed on a female disciple. He remembered clearly that the first day he arrived, she was the first to greet him. She seemed to be quite authoritative among this group of female disciples. She was dressed in cotton cloth and an apron, no makeup on, sweat beading her forehead. This shimmy, Sui-Mo went to greet her. Even though his age was most likely smaller than the other, but due to the rules of the sect, he didn't dare to overstep. She saw Sui-Mo and hurriedly stood, Sui Shixiang. I've just gotten here and do not know many of the rules in the yard. Master is focused on making Dan, so I can only trouble shimmy. Sui-Mo said warmly. But it was a pity that his face was frozen and it looked slightly frightening. After the initial panic, the female disciples quickly calmed down and said, Shixiang is too polite. What is Shixiang's question? Sui-Mo asked her his question. This female disciple brushed away the hair in front of her head and smiled. Shixiang might not know, but all the herbs in this yard belong to the sect. Other than a certain amount that can be withdrawn, all others need people to pay with Jingxi. But the price is 2/10 lower than the market price. Shixiang is a Ling plant farmer. If you have Ling plants and grasses, you can sell them to this yard. The purchase price of normal herbs are about 2/10 lower than the market price, but other than Jingxi, Shixiang will receive contribution points to exchange for scriptures and other things. If it is rare and valuable Ling herbs and grasses, our sect's purchase price is the same as the market. In the future when Shixiang becomes accomplished at Dan making, the sect can help sell the Dan that Shixiang makes. Our sect's Yan Lushu is skilled at business and usually can sell them for a good price. He only takes 2/10 as a commission. But like before, other than Jingxi, Shixiang can receive contribution points. Finishing, she handed Sui-Mo a jade stick. The price of Ling grasses and herbs will change each month. Yan Lushu will order someone to make it into a jade stick. This is the inventory list of the prices for this month of Ling herbs. Sui-Mo took it and gave his thanks. Shixiang doesn't have to be too polite. Shimmy is Su Qing and the first seed of this yard's outer sect disciples. In the future, Shixiang, please take care of me. If Shixiang has any questions, come find me. You can also find me if you need to purchase any materials. Su Qing said respectfully. Thanks, Shimmy. Sui-Mo said gratefully. Taking the list, Sui-Mo went back to the Dan room and studied the list. He calculated and found the cost of the raw materials for the fasting pill was about 3 pieces of second-grade jingsha, and its price was only half a second-grade jingsha over the cost of the materials. If the success rate was accounted for, there was basically no profit. As expected, it was basically impossible to rely on low-level Dan to make money. It really was just practice. But that was normal. If fasting pills were really that profitable, then countless people would be breaking their heads for a chance to learn how to make Dan. In the following days, Mo continued to make fasting pills. In the process, he had failed once, but as he became more familiar, it took a lot less effort. 10 portions of materials, it made 6 fasting pills. This kind of result could only be called just passable. There was nothing that was worth being proud of. Other than leaving behind the 5 pills, the last one he sold to Su Qing and received 3 pieces of second-grade jingsha. Adding on that he would have an allowance of 20 pieces of second-grade jingsha, he finally wasn't penniless. In the Ling fields of West Wind Valley, Mo carefully examined each stalk of Ling herbs and grass. In the jade sticks of Elder Wei Nan, there had been detailed introductions of these herbs and the methods of cultivating them that he had found. Like snowy foxtail grass, it was snowy white and soft, named for its foxtail-like shape. Its biggest use was to make a famous kind of paper, snowy fox paper. Snowy fox paper was soft and pure white, extremely well suited for making paper seals. Paper was a kind of widespread material. Other than all kinds of paper cranes, it was an essential ingredient in making seal curses and seal soldiers. But the cultivation of snowy foxtail grass wasn't easy as its growth was slow. Especially for snowy foxtail grass which was above 3rd grade. The price was never low. Only 3rd grade snowy foxtail grass could be used to manufacture 4th grade snowy fox paper. Elder Wei Nan had discovered a method for cultivating snowy foxtail grass. The most effective way was to plant it with butterfly grass. Butterfly grass was an extremely common kind of Ling grass. Only the most docile and hardy Ling beasts would eat it. Basically, no one would plant it. But if butterfly grass and snowy foxtail grass were planted together, the growth speed of snowy foxtail grass would increase, and the blue-purple butterfly grass would become a rare sky blue. This sky blue butterfly grass was deeply favored by all kinds of Ling beasts, especially high-grade Ling beasts. The price wasn't low. Many times, Mo couldn't help but be in awe of Elder Wei Nan who he had never met. In Elder Wei Nan's jade sticks, there wasn't any profound scriptures, but useful techniques like this one were countless. Like the method of growing butterfly grass and snowy foxtail grass together, he felt that even the most experienced and powerful Ling plant farmers wouldn't have thought of it. Maybe, it was because Elder Wei Nan didn't have very high cultivation so he would spend so much effort studying those things. Every day, Mo would cast the spells of a Ling plant farmer on the plants in the Ling fields. The amount of work was much greater than he had imagined but he had endured. Over time, he had gotten used to it. He kept on cultivating, embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, each day in the rock room. In the past, he hadn't known the many uses of spiritual energy and had more or less been inattentive. Now that he had seen the effects, he was much more focused. In a reversal of the past, he actually was not in a hurry to enter Zhuji anymore. His spiritual power was much stronger than before but there was a lot of room for him to improve. With the help of the Ling vein, the progress of the Ling energy in his body was faster than his estimations. Zhuji wasn't far away. He had a premonition. Dongfu Hall. Dongfu Hall was the residence of the master of Dongfu. It had been constructed for Dongfu Xianren and had been used since then. It took up the biggest secret paradise in Dongfu and it was Dongfu's one true secret paradise. The so-called secret paradises that were sold on the market were only places with slightly more abundant Ling energy and couldn't be really considered a secret paradise. Yu Bai slowly woke up from his meditation, satisfaction gleaming in his warm eyes. The density of Ling energy in Dong Fu Hall was multiple times what it was outside. The fact that he could become the leader of the younger generation of Dong Fu was in large part due to this point. The effects of his daily meditation was 2 or 3 times what other people had. After accumulating over the years, this kind of advantage would increasingly become greater. Master. Seeing Master, he hurriedly stood. How have you been feeling recently? Tian Song Zi asked as he smiled harmoniously. Tian Song Zi was wearing the robes of a Taoist, a knot on his head, extremely carefree. Relatively stable, but still far from becoming Jin Dan. No hurry, no hurry. Tian Song Zi waved his hand, you are still young, don't rush. Becoming Jin Dan is a process. Did you hear the news about the sword test conference? Yu Bai paused, does Master want this disciple to attend the sword test conference? Even though he had a shining reputation in Dongfu, but he really didn't much confidence in attending the sword test conference, which was a large-scale completion for the entire Kunlun Jing. And from what he had seen, Master never really cared about worldly rewards, so why would he suddenly become interested in the sword test conference? Tian Song Zi smiled, answering, wait for me to finish. The internal happenings of the sword test conference are layered, but we don't have to touch that dirty water. His expression became severe, his gaze worried, and said solemnly, I received news that 2/3 of Bloody Sky Metropolis has already landed in the hands of Yamo. Ah! Yu Bai paled in shock, how could that be so? Yamo are starting to recover their strength. Tian Song Zi sighed, 3,000 years have passed. Yamo recuperated and have adapted. Would they be satisfied being suppressed? Yu Bai's expression was incomparably bad. He knew what this meant. The situation in the future is hard to predict. My Dong Fu needs to prepare early. Tian Song Zi said heavily, I will host a Dong Fu sword test conference in hopes of finding some potential talents. When the nest is being attacked, will there be unharmed eggs? I will tell the other sections. Right now, it has to be a united front in order to fight for a chance at survival. Yu Bai was silent. A beat later, he said, I'm afraid Master will put in the effort but not be thanked. Do within the limits, and depend on the heavens. Tian Song Zi sighed and waved his hand, go and create a list of youths that should be taken note of. Yes. Yu Bai bowed and retreated with a worried expression. Chapter 43 First Grade Ling Dan. His cold-faced master seemed to have no intentions of wanting to come out of her Dan room. With Jingshi on his hands, Zhuo Mo decided to start working on his Dan-making skills. At the very least, for basic Dan like fasting pills, he shouldn't have problems such as the efficiency rate. Buying the materials from Su Qing Shimi, Zhuo Mo started to furiously practice making fasting pills. His income and costs basically was even. The biggest question Zhuo Mo faced was how to avoid failure. Failing once meant losing 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. His level of familiarity had greatly increased. The time needed for the process shortened from the previous 10 hours to 6 hours, but the cost was also enormous. His 20-something pieces of second-grade Jingshi had been completely squandered. It was all caused by the failures. But thinking about the future, he could only grit his teeth and bear it. This was the last portion of ingredients for the today. If he could successfully make it, he could just manage to return to Su Qing Shimi the 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi that he owed her. These days, as he had become familiar with Su Qing Shimi, he could leave a tab as he brought materials daily. Zhuo Mo didn't want to owe any debts. After making this fasting pill, he wanted to rest for a time and wait for the Ling herbs in the Ling fields to mature. Even though there was only a single portion, he wasn't nervous. After the repeated high-intensity practice of the past days, he was now extremely familiar with the process of making fasting pills. He didn't know if it was caused by the spiritual power, but his head seemed to be functioning better. He hadn't been weak before, but it had felt like he was in the clouds and mists. Now, he seemed to have left behind those clouds. Did cultivating, embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, make someone smarter? This idea was too nonsensical. Even Zhuo felt it was extremely absurd and threw it to one side. Just like normal, Zhuo threw the different herbs into the cauldron and put his hands on the 8 trigrams plate to start. The consciousness was especially sensitive to changes in Ling energy. He occasionally was able to even feel the Ling energy changes in the herbs inside the cauldron. Some became excited, some flashed and disappeared, some slowly became weaker. Even though he was very familiar with the fasting pill, but the kinds of Ling energy transformations and vibrations between the herbs still attracted his attention. Unconsciously, his consciousness became muddled. It was like the hands that were controlling the 8 trigrams plate suddenly were possessed and abruptly changed their position. A thin string of gold light dropped from the sky and landed in his hands, then was deflected into the cauldron. After a while, he slowly became clear-headed again. When he saw the gold string, he stared in shock. How did he end up casting Art of Crimson Flame? He shook. Damn it! Don't ruin the Dan. He still owed Su Qing Shimi 3 pieces of second-grade jingsha. If this Dan was ruined, then he really had outstanding debts. His consciousness penetrated through the cauldron. A reaction had not occurred inside. Zhuo's heart jumped and he hurriedly opened the cauldron. A green Dan was lying silently on the bottom. Zhuo released a breath. It looked as though that it hadn't been ruined. He raised the fasting pill and prepared to put it in the pouch when he saw a glitter of gold light from the corner of his eye. He first blanked, and then rushed to hold this fasting pill on his hand in front of his eyes for a closer examination. Only upon close examination did he find that this fasting pill was different than the fasting pills he had made previously. The color was deep green, not the blue-green. If he looked even more closely, he found that there were extremely thin gold patterns mixed inside. That was the cause of that gold light that Zhuo had detected just now. Also, the weight of it was slightly heavier than normal fasting pills. Was this still a fasting pill? Zhuo wasn't so sure. Eating it to try it out, Zhuo didn't dare. But he didn't bear to throw it away. Selling it to Su Qing Shimi, he was afraid of conning someone else. He knew that the transformation definitely was caused by the Art of Crimson Flame that he unconsciously cast when his thoughts had been wandering. Theoretically, Art of Crimson Flame was used to gather the essence of the sun. Its base attribute should lean towards fire and logically, the Dan shouldn't be harmful. Pondering for a while, he still decided to keep this Dan. After Master came out of the Dan room, he would then ask her. Master had entered the Dan room over 10 days ago, yet the door to the room was still tightly shut. Sometimes, Zhuo couldn't help but think, was all skilled Dan cultivators like this? He had finished his quota a long time ago, but Master didn't show any signs of coming out of the Dan room. Zhuo decided to work on his own cultivation. Under the present circumstances, he had reached his limits with the 5 spells of a Ling plant farmer. To progress, he needed to have jade scrolls about future stages. Other than practicing finger motions to avoid becoming out of practice, he spent the rest of his time on embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, and refining his sword essence. He didn't know if refining was the word commonly used, but he felt that it was very descriptive. Right now, his sword essence had only formed. It was like a sword embryo that needed continuous hammering and grinding before it could become a true sword. Xin Yen Shishu's sword essence was deeply engraved in his head. Under that sky-shattering sword essence, he had died countless times. What he needed to do was to try to mimic Shishu's sword essence. If he couldn't get the aura, at the least, he had to form the appearance. Then he could frighten people with it. He was resolute that unless it was necessary, he wouldn't show it. Even Yubai could clearly see his origins. If it landed in the eyes of Master and the Shishu, it would be strange if they weren't suspicious. Xin Yen Shishu had never taught him. If they pressed, Pu Yao's existence most likely couldn't be hidden. Whenever he thought about Yin Zan Shirshu's icy gaze, Zhua Mo felt shivers go up his spine. No matter the sect, stealing was a great crime. Zhua Mo was very regretful now about having fought in Dongfu. Who would have thought that Yu Bai's eyes were so keen that he could see the origins of his sword essence? But regret was useless now. In any case, it was dealing with it as it came. The barefoot wasn't afraid of those wearing shoes. He actually put even more effort in practicing now. He couldn't use a flying sword. As a result, he could only work with Art of Aged Gold. He faithfully followed the basic sword scriptures that Wei Xing Shixiang had left behind in the jade sticks. He hadn't felt it before, but after comprehending sword essence, Zhua Mo found that while these basic scriptures might be simple, but every one of them was important. So he turned back and started to practice these most basic scriptures. Before this, Zhua Mo had never cultivated the sword and really could be considered a blank page in this area. After being sliced countless times by Pu Yao using Xin Yen Shirshu's sword essence, he finally comprehended something. But his fundamentals were really lacking, and so even with his comprehension, it was not rooted. If he didn't steady it, the comprehension would quickly be worn away. Because of it, he was now turning back to cultivate the most basic of the basic sword scriptures. These basic scriptures were all gathered from Wei Xing's experience of countless battles. They were practical and effective. Zhua Mo, who had a slight comprehension of sword essence, could look from a higher viewpoint to judge these basic scriptures, and he learnt extremely quickly. These basic sword scriptures managed to help fill the gaps of Zhua Mo's fundamentals. In the little West Wind Yard, Zhua Mo solitarily practiced those basic sword scriptures. The sword scriptures were very simple. It could be learned on the first try. But it was like Zhua Mo was enchanted as he patiently practiced over and over. Before meeting Pu Yao, before meeting Wei Xing Shixiang, the spell he was most skilled with, Little Art of Cloud and Rain, had been refined like this. He never hoped for any kind of enlightenment. In his mind, nothing was more practical than working at something bit by bit. Behind the most beautiful and exquisite things, was the most dullness and loneliness. He was very skilled with embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, and his Ling energy was steadily increasing. In comparison, his spiritual power progressed much faster. He was like a cultivator in seclusion, each day was scheduled to the fullest, and no time was wasted. What was worth celebrating was that the damned crazy woman hadn't bothered him recently. Time passed like this. A sword energy fly out of the sky. Zhua Mo, who had been practicing sword scriptures in the yard, stopped. Master had come out. Jumping onto the roof, climbing onto the back of the gray-beaked goose, the gray-beaked goose gave a clear call and flew up with spread wings. It carried Zhua Mo towards the fragrant ginger yard. Fragrant ginger yard. There was tiredness on Shifeng Rong's face. The dan-making process had been more than a month, and it had taken a heavy toll on her. When Zhua Mo arrived, Su Qing was reporting to her what had happened in the yard during the time. Seeing Zhua Mo come over, Shifeng Rong's face became cold. Have you made 5 fasting pills? Completed. Zhua Mo presented the 5 fasting pills he had prepared beforehand with a lowered head. Shifeng Rong's expression eased slightly and indicated for Su Qing to take it. Nodding her head, she said, "Not bad, it seemed that you hadn't been lazy. You've just started dan making, so if you have any questions, you can ask them now." At the side, Su Qing gave an admiring expression. She might be the first seed of Fragrant Ginger Yard's outer sect disciples, and was very trusted by Shifeng Rong, but she could only learn, but didn't have the right to ask questions. However, she quickly refocused. She hadn't been thrown out, that meant she was allowed to listen. This was a rare opportunity. Hearing this, Zhua Mo was overjoyed and asked several questions he had been puzzled by. Shifeng Rong answered them one by one. Zhua Mo suddenly thought about the dan that he had used, Art of Crimson Flame, to make and rushed to take it out. "Master, this is a Dan that I accidentally made. It seems to be different from the fasting pill. This disciple doesn't know what it is. Master, please take a look. Shi Fengrong took the Dan and couldn't help but make a sound as she carefully examined it. After a while, she asked, "Tell how you made it." Zhuemo narrated the entire process in detail. When he mentioned that he had accidentally cast, Art of Crimson Flame, Shi Fengrong seemed to have understood something. When Zhuemo finished, Shi Fengrong said, "This fasting pill has essence of the sun added in. The effects are extremely young and can enter the ranks of first-grade Dan. After consumption, it can make one stimulated, and arouse Ling energy. But the side effects afterward would most likely not be minor. I have never seen this kind of Dan before. You can name it and find your Yan Lusher Shu to sell it and earn some Jingshi." Zhuemo asked dumbly, "How much could it sell for?" Shi Fengrong's face turned cold. "Go ask yourself." Finishing, she started to ignore Zhuemo. Zhuemo didn't know where he had offended his cold-faced master and could only leave. However, he quickly became happy again. He had accidentally managed to make a Ling Dan. Fasting pills could only be considered a kind of medicine Dan and couldn't be really called a Ling Dan, much less enter a grade. Zhuemo was very clear that any Ling Dan that could enter the grade, its price wouldn't be low. For Zhuemo, who was in desperate need of Jingshi, what would make him even happier than finding a way to earn Jingshi? Countless Jingshi were waving their hands at him. He mused inside, he need to find a time to go see Yan Lusher Shu. Chapter 44. A tragedy caused by one piece of Jingshi. Zhuemo named this Ling Dan, Great Strength Pill. It sounded extremely crass, but he didn't care. He had planned on making a few more to give to Yan Lusher Shu to sell for Jingshi, but very quickly, he could only put this matter to the side. In the Ling fields, a batch of Ling grasses and herbs were ready for harvest. He had farmed attentively each day. Like Little Art of Cloud and Rain, Art of Earth Energy, and Art of Crimson Flame, he would cast it multiple times each day. And Art of Flora, and Art of Aged Gold, would be used once every couple of days. Zhuemo had never farmed like this in the past. Due to his diligent care, the growth of the plants in West Wind Valley was extremely outstanding. Some of the Ling plants with short growth periods were ready for harvest. For Zhuemo, whose purse was rusted, this was really a perfectly timed rainstorm. Due to its importance, he even asked for a break from Master. Inside West Wind Valley, a skeleton bent over the Ling fields and sweated. Finally all done. Zhuemo sat on the ground as he panted. Looking at the small pile of Ling plants in front of him, he was filled with satisfaction. Then he turned to look in the corner. The third-grade fire dragon grass was almost full-grown. A bright fiery red, very beautiful. He sorted out the Ling grasses and herbs by type and then by grade. Then he carefully wrapped them. After all that, Zhuemo rode the gray-beaked goose towards Yan Lusher Shu's residence. When Yan Lu saw Zhuemo, especially the big bag on Zhuemo's back, his eyes instantly lit up. Did Shiji grow something good? Putting down the large bag, Zhuemo wiped the sweat on his forehead. This is a bunch of Ling herbs that were just grown. Shibwa, please help me sell them. Letting someone else sell them required giving 2/10 to the sect, but Zhuemo still decided to let the sect sell them. Other than the fact that Yan Lusher knew more about the market than he did, the sect's contribution points were very useful. And the more one contributed to the sect, their status within the sect would naturally become higher. Even though Pu Yao was in his sea of consciousness, but this fickle and perverse Ren Yao could not be relied on. Pu Yao was a completely dangerous factor. If he didn't have to touch him, it was best not to. In comparison, Zhuemo was much more willing to take advantage of the sect's power. At the very least, the elders of the sect appeared to be normal people. But this way, raising his own status in the sect had become very important. Cultivation, the higher it went, the more resources it needed. Trying to rely on an individual's power, it was far less realistic than using the power of the sect. Even roaming cultivators had their own little circles. Cultivators who truly secluded themselves were the rarest of the rare. Yen Lu crouched down and flipped through the ling grasses Mo had brought, the joy on his face becoming heavier. Lots of good stuff. Third grade South Wolfberry, third grade 7-leaf chrysanthemum, whoa, and there's also daystar grass, also third grade. This can be sold for a pretty good price. Yen Lu seemed to be very familiar and recognized all of the ling grasses and grains. Mo was in awe and hurriedly flattered, "Shibwa is really great, you recognize all of these." Shifeng Rong was the smallest of the four, so Mo's address of Yen Lu turned from Shu to Shibwa. In business, you have to recognize those. Yen Lu felt very good about Mo's flattery. His originally small eyes became a line and he said amiably, as expected of a ling plant farmer. To grow something, not just faster than others, but better than others. Shiji has put thought in. All you planted are things easy to sell and at a good price. He didn't know if it was that he felt guilt, but Mo felt that Yen Li's gaze seemed full of meaning. Did Shibwa also know about Elder Wei Nan? He forced himself to remain calm. Shibwa should also know just how poor this disciple is. If I don't plant something to sell, I won't even have the jingsha for learning about dan making. He was very grateful for his zombie face. It really was the best disguise. Yen Lu nodded, haha. Without jingsha, you can't learn anything. You are a ling plant farmer now, don't worry about jingsha. As long as you keep farming, us elders wouldn't treat you unfairly. Of course, of course. Mo smiled in agreement, but his expressionless face truly gave others a strange feeling. Yen Lu randomly picked 2 plants out, South Wolfberry, and this gold grain red tulip. Don't sell it, you keep it. In the future, you'll use it in dan making. I remember your master had especially asked me to help gather it for her. These 2 are easily sold, but it's hard to buy. Mo hurriedly put away those 2 ling herbs. Everything else I'll go help you sell. What the sect needs, I will give to you according to the market price. Finishing, he took out a piece of jingsha to hand to Mo. This is a piece of third grade jingsha. It's a down payment. Take it. I'll get your Liang Feng Shiji to send over the remainder in a few days. Mo stared dazedly at the third grade jingsha on Yen Li's hand. Third grade jingsha. This was the first piece of third grade jingsha that he had ever seen. Seeing Mo's dumb gaze, Yen Lu couldn't help but start to laugh. He threw the jingsha at Mo. Arlite, outside, don't embarrass me like this. Mo's brain still hadn't managed to fully recover. Previously, he had thought that this harvest would be of some value, but he had never thought that just the down payment was a piece of third grade jingsha. The wealth that dropped down from the sky pounded Mo into dizziness. He felt that his entire body was floating. He suddenly remembered another matter. Mo, who had been walking away, turned back and took out, great strength pill. Shibwa, can you see how much this lingdan is worth? Yen Lu took the lingdan and narrowed his eyes for an examination. You made it? What's its use? Mo narrated what master had said. Then I'll try to help you sell it. Everyone takes some time to accept new lingdan. I cannot guarantee how much I can sell this for. Yen Lu said after thinking. Mo naturally was very grateful. His purse being the fullest it had ever been, he completely forgot that he had thought of using great strength pill to earn jingsha. Even as he returned to the little west wind yard, he was still muddle-headed. Like a miser, he looked at this third-grade jingsha. The color and intactness of a third-grade jingsha far surpassed a second-grade jingsha. All the edges were regular and complete, the entire body transparent and glowing without any signs of impurity. It was like a clear crystal. But the ling energy inside was extremely powerful. He gently caressed the jingsha, a drunken expression in his eyes. Suddenly, his hands seemed to have been cut by something, and the jingsher in his hands lit up unexpectedly. Suemo stood, paralyzed, as he looked at the glowing jingsher. A strong pounding feeling rose in his heart as though something was going to erupt. The glow from the jingsher gradually faded, but the pounding in Suemo's heart became even stronger. What was going on? He was slightly panicked. Idiot, you are entering Zhuji. Pu Yao suddenly appeared with a mocking smile as he looked at Suemo. Zhuji. Suemo couldn't attend to the disdain in Pu Yao's voice and hurriedly asked, "What's going on? Why am I suddenly going into Zhuji?" Pu Yao shrugged his shoulders. When there is enough Ling energy, naturally it is time for Zhuji. You just have been stimulated by the Ling energy in the jingsher, so the Ling energy inside your body, woke up. Woke up. What am I supposed to do? Suemo didn't know what to do. Damn it. He hadn't thought he would get to Zhuji so soon. He hadn't even made any preparations. He didn't know what was going to happen next, or what he needed to do. He had always felt that Zhuji was far from him. Right, he could go ask the Shirbua. Suemo hit his head and prepared to run towards the gray-beaked goose. Under the shadow of the hair in front of Pu Yao's face, a blade-like curve silently appeared. Don't you want power? I have a method for Zhuji, pretty good, guarantee you will successfully Zhuji and your cultivation will increase greatly. Pu Yao's cool voice was filled with intense enticement. Suemo's footsteps stopped. What do you want? Suemo asked between his teeth. He. Pu Yao pointed to Suemo's hands with the third-grade jingsher. As expected, this Ren Yao didn't have good intentions. So he was aiming for his third-grade jingsher. Suemo was enraged and snorted, I should ask Shirbua, Zhuji, it's the first gate for a cultivator. But many people don't know that it's also one of the most important gates. It would directly influence your future cultivation. Don't blame me for not warning you. Using those Zhuji Dan won't be of any benefit to you. Pu Yao said leisurely. The pounding in his heart became even stronger. Suemo felt as though his heart was going to jump out of his chest. Pu Yao's words landed in his ear but became hazy and intangible. Those Shirbua of yours. It's not that I'm underestimating them, but they can't give you much power. Look at your master, she's just not the opponent of the person that changed your features and erased your mind. How about it? I've never cheated you. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation is useful, right? Sword essence, oh, you've reached the threshold. Me, I'm very trustworthy. Pu Yao smiled gently, peerlessly beautiful. One piece of third-grade jingsher, this is really cheap. Just a piece of third-grade jingsher. If you put some effort in it, you'll earn it again. But the benefits you'll receive would be endless. Is there a business more profitable than this one in this world? The pounding inside his heart became even stronger. Everything in his vision seemed to become twisted. Suemo felt that something inside his body seemed to have been lit up. Thirsty. He licked his lips and swallowed the saliva. He had a feeling that going to find Master now, there wouldn't be enough time. Here. Suemo gritted his teeth and threw the third-grade jingsher hard at Pu Yao. He wanted to smash this Ren Yao. The smart choice. Pu Yao easily caught the jingsher, his thin lips opening. Take that fire dragon grass to Cold Mist Valley. Fire dragon grass. Suemo's eyes widened as he forced the words through his teeth. This guy. Suemo wanted to cry. The kind of terrifying thing that was fire dragon grass, only terrifying people like Shixiang could tolerate it. People like him, there was only one outcome, that was, Ling energy collapsing in death. Pu Yao's right eye curved into a crescent and reminded Suemo, there's not much time left. The feeling of burning inside his body became even stronger. Suemo wanted to rip off the clothing. The blood vessels were like burning metal pipes. He was abnormally thirsty, abnormally uncomfortable. There wasn't much time left. Unable to care about that much, he took out the spirit-traveling seal and pasted it onto his legs. All the Ling energy in his body moving, he grabbed the fire dragon grass, and ran towards cold misty valley like a ball of red clouds. He shouted inside. "Pooh! You cursed Renyao!" Chapter 45 Struggle Cold Mist Valley, beside the icy pond. Zhuemo looked horrific, his entire body looked like a cooked shrimp, red to the point of dripping blood. Bloody veins filled his eyes, which were extremely shocking. In the yard, his body had been like a ball of fire. Right now, he felt his entire body was firewood that had been completely dried and then lit up, and was cracking as it burned. He looked around, slightly dazed. Everything in his vision seemed to have been twisted by the high temperature. His awareness was muddled. Hot. He seemed to be struggling in a sea of fire, the relentless waves of fire suffocating him. At any moment, it seemed he would turn into dust. Eat the fire dragon grass. A faraway voice floated into Zhuemo's ears. Instinctively, Zhuemo shoved the fire dragon grass in his hand into his mouth. A wave of heat traveled through his mouth into his throat. Boom! It was like throwing a pot of hot oil onto fire. In a daze, Zhuemo felt the sea of fire seem to have collapsed, and countless fine and scorching flames spread through his organs. The rush of heat was like liquid metal bouncing around in Zhuemo's meridians. Ah! Zhuemo couldn't stop himself from screaming. A hot stream rushed into his head. His fragile head seemed to have been branded with hot metal. Poof! A flame suddenly ran onto his clothing. The fire quickly spread. In the blink of an eye, all the clothing on his body turned to flames. What was strange was the fire didn't wound Zhuemo at all. Zhuemo was naked in the air, his entire body red like a metal skeleton that just came out of the forge. It was possible to see with the naked eye the waves of hot air that were surrounding his body. Ah 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 ah. The howls were deep and rough, like those of a beast. All the blood vessels in Zhuemo's body were enlarged, like metal threads that were being burnt as they encompassed his entire body. So pleasing to the ears. Looking on from the side, Pu Yao's face was intoxicated as he sighed, "Even the soul is in pain. It's been so long since I've heard such an enchanting sound, I really missed it." Ah ah ah. Zhuemo completely lost his mind. He was like a wild beast whose entire body was burning, and howled instinctively. The fire didn't seem content rushing inside his body and burrowed out of his skin, shrouding his body. He became a ball of fire. If Zhuemo was clear-headed at this moment, he would be shocked to find the fire that was burning his body was deep red and alluring, extremely similar to the fire in his sea of consciousness. Looking at the deep red flames that were furiously dancing on Zhuemo's body, Pu Yao's gaze instantly darkened. The corner of his mouth, however, swept up. It was unknown what he had been reminded of. The sound of Zhuemo's howls became even deeper, even rougher. The flames surrounding him seemed to burn even more ferociously. Pu Yao's expression changed. After a while, his gaze returned to normal and he said to himself, "The person you chose, I'll give him one chance." Finishing, he pointed a finger at Zhuemo. Zhuemo seemed to have been struck by a large hammer and was sent flying, landing with a splash in the cold pond. Zhuemo was like a stone, quickly sinking. Strangely, the deep red flames around his body were not affected in the slightest by the water, and were still furiously waving. Just at this time, the ice river in Zhuemo's sea of consciousness suddenly started to grind. The icicles crowding in the ice river were pushed by an invisible force and slowly started to flow. The silent and straight ice river, in the blink of an eye, transformed into a river where countless big and small sword energies were moving. Hiss hiss hiss. These sword energies followed the surface of the river as they headed for the flames surrounding the river. As the icy sword essences touched the dancing flames beside the shores, the unexpected happened. The fire grew dramatically. In the sea of consciousness, the fire reached the sky, even the star in the void overhead was almost consumed by the fire. Only the gravestone in the sea of consciousness was still shrouded in the black clouds, not affected in the slightest. Inside the ice river, the icicles rose up and down even fiercer, the sword essences continuously shooting out with white mist towards the sea of fire. An astounding change was also appearing on Zhuomo's body. A thin layer of ice had appeared on his entirely flushed body. Yet in the blink of an eye, this thin layer would melt and disappear. But after a while, the layer of ice would appear again and repeat. The cold pond wasn't deep. Zhuomo quickly reached the bottom of the pond. The temperature at the bottom of the pond was multiple times colder than the water at the top, no fish or shrimp to be found. As though it was affected, each time the thin ice appeared, the time it stayed became longer. However, the fires around Zhuomo's body wasn't weakened at all, they were still burning weirdly in the water. A faint light suddenly appeared in Zhuomo's chest. This light traveled through Zhuomo's channels. Every place it passed through, the flame would become smaller, but then very quickly, the red flames would once again continue their dancing. Zhuomo seemed to have entered a very strange place. He had completely lost control of his body. Hazily, he felt that he was being burned in a furnace, and then suddenly thrown into the polar regions, but no matter the torment, he didn't have any room to struggle. Don't forget, even in death, you must not forget, the voice appeared again. A basin of cold water seemed to have been poured over Zhuomo's head. His consciousness recovered clarity for a short moment. Upon clarity, the extreme pain of burning and the bone-aching cold flooded him like the tide. He couldn't help opening his mouth. The icy pond water instantly poured into his mouth. There was nothing that could describe his feelings at this moment. His entire body was furiously burning, the extreme pain from his flesh and bones burning bit by bit almost made him faint. The pond water that had poured in almost froze him to an ice cube. His clear mind instantly became dizzy again. Was this Shuji? Was this the power of the fire dragon grass? That dream. In a daze, Zhuomo's relaxed hands suddenly turned into fists. His entire body bowed, all the strength in the body gathering at this moment. His eyes widened furiously, bright red. Who? Who wanted to control me? Who changed my face and erased my mind? Who did it? Who did it? From the depths of his mind, countless thoughts uncontrollably streamed through. From the depths of his body came a pain of his flesh burning and the bone-breaking coldness. Inside his angry eyes, the flames were swallowed by a bloody red tide. Who did it? Who did it? Who did it? Bastard! The blood in his chest roared. The anger and grief that came from the deepest part of his heart erupted like a volcano. In an instant, it swallowed the fire and the ice. Zhuomo seemed to be cursed. He gathered all the energy in his body and threw out his fist. Accompanied by the deep red alluring flames, his fist heavily smashed onto the rock side of the pond. Boom! With Zhuomo's fist as the center, a spiderweb of cracks appeared on the rock face. Scorch marks spread out from the center of the impact. Boom! Another punch. Stone fragments flew into the water. A few of them brushed past Zhuomo's body, creating a few marks. The fresh blood flowed out, quickly dissolving in the water. Boom boom boom. Zhuomo was completely stuck in a trance. His eyes bright red, the tendons tight, he furiously threw out punches. The silent bottom of the pond turned into a muddy mess. Beside the pond, Pu Yao detected the vibrations of the ground. Looking at the whirlpool that appeared in the body, his expression was normal as he raised a hand and caught a water droplet that flew out from the waterfall. Opening his hand, the water drop floated above his bond, round and clear as it reflected his blood eye. You're still not giving a hand? Do you still stupidly believe he could suppress the fire of the sky yell? A faint mocking smile appeared on his face as he slowly stated, "You are always like this, never listening to me. 3,000 years have passed yet you are still so stubborn. Do you not know that your choices are forever this idiotic?" He gently blew and the perfect water droplet floating in his hand turned to a gust of mist and dissipated into the air. "Your actions, I was sick of them long ago." Pu Yao patted his hand, his expression indifferent. The vibrations under his feet stopped, the pond recovered its quiet. "It's done." Pu Yao's sharp lips rose and he shrugged, This only proved once again your idiotic choices." He just turned his head when he stopped in his steps. Wukong Mountain, Xian Yen who had been in meditation suddenly opened his eyes. He jumped up, his body disappearing. In the blink of an eye, he appeared at the peak. A few seconds later, Pei Yuan ran, Yen Luan Shifeng Rong also flew over and appeared beside him. The four exchanged looks and with shocked faces, they raised their heads to look at the sky. Dong Fu, Tian Song Zi was browsing the list that Yu Bai had written. "This Zhong Ming Yen is Zhua Mei Tian's disciple." Tian Song Zi nodded as he remarked, "In Dong Fu, if we're talking about strength, it's between Zhua Mei Tian and Xin Yen. Zhua Mei Tian had been very fierce in the past, a person everyone was afraid of. This point was very similar to Xin Yen. But I wonder what his disciple is like." Yu Bai said respectfully, "This disciple had met that Zhong Ming Yen once. Even though we didn't fight, but this disciple gathers from his composure that he most likely isn't weak." There's isn't many youths that you call not weak. I heard that Zhua Mei Tian had put in a lot of blood on this disciple. It's natural he wouldn't be weak." Tian Song Zi chuckled, "In the future, Dong Fu is probably yours, Zhong Ming Yen and Wukong Sword Sex Wei Xing's world. This disciple will not disappoint Master's hopes." Yu Bai responded respectfully. Tian Song Zi waved his hands, "Don't care too much about things like reputation. I only hope you can protect yourself in troubled times. This estate, I might not bear to part with it, but your safety is even more important." Yu Bai was moved and responded, "Yes." Seeing Yu Bai's face was full of worry, Tian Song Zi couldn't help but comfort, "This master is only planning ahead. Don't worry too much. If something really happens, us old people will be at the front." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a name on the list and was slightly shocked. When was there a Zhua Mo out of Wukong Sword Sect? How is he special? The first time this disciple heard this name, he had been in a conflict with Zhong Ming Yen and another Dong Qi disciples. Because he is a Ling plant farmer, this disciple had been planning on resolving it. I did not expect that he managed to comprehend sword essence. Yu Bai added another sentence, "He has not entered Juji." Oh. Tian Song Zi's expression changed, another dangerous character in Wukong Sword Sect. Comprehending sword essence before entering Juji. This kind of sword talent, it's very rare. The heavens really have blessed Wukong Sword Sect. Between his words, he was slightly envious. Just at this time, his expression suddenly changed and flew out the window. Yu Bai paused before hurriedly following. He only saw Tian Song Zi staring in a daze at the sky above. At the same time, on the highest plum peak of Dong Qi Sword Sect, a long-haired black-robed man stood against the wind. With a shocked face, he raised his head to look at the sky. Chapter 46 Juji The peak of daytime, the sky was blue and clear, yet what raised people's hairs was that the blue sky was filled with blazing stars. Stars in daytime, Pei Yuan Ran muttered to himself. The other three's expressions all changed. Shi Xiang. Shifeng Rong's voice was slightly trembling, "What is happening here?" "I don't know." Pei Yuan Ran's expression was heavy as he shook his head. The apparition of stars appearing in daytime, it happens once every few thousand years. I've only seen it in some records. But it doesn't seem to be a good omen. Even though the four were all Jindan, looking at the strange scene in front of them, their hearts couldn't help but feel cold. In Dongfu, Yu Bai stared with wide eyes at the stars dotting the sky and that proud sun hanging high up in the sky. Fear rose up from the deepest part of his heart and spread through his body. Tian Song Zi muttered, "Stars in daytime, the plum peak of Dongqi." Light erupted from Zhua Mei Tian's eyes as he murmured, "Stars in daytime, in the entire sky moon Jia." Countless strong people were all alarmed. Looking up at the sky over the 13 primary towns of Sky Moon Jia, it was completely filled with cultivators. In the wilderness, on the mountaintops, no matter what the Xiuzha were doing, they all stopped their hands and floated in midair. All of the cultivators' gazes, they were completely focuses on this sky that they were so familiar with. No matter their cultivation, shock was on everyone's face. In Cold Mist Valley, Pu Yao's pupils shrunk. He gazed at the pond before him. In his blood-red vision, he could clearly see a pillar of light that glittered as it came down from the sky and entered the pond. If one used a normal vision, where could they even see a pillar? No Ling energy, no vibrations. Only through his blood eye could this intangible pillar of light be seen. "Do you think you had wagered correctly?" Pu Yao said coldly, murderous intent in his right blood eye. When the sound landed, the clear pond suddenly became as dark as ink. The sound of the waterfall disappeared without a trace. The waterfall was like a broken mustang, docilely flowing into the pond without a splash. The valley fell into a strange silence. Looking at the black water pond, Pu Yao wasn't afraid. He took a strong stride forward, pressing, "For this trash, you decide to fight me?" The black water pond was silent and motionless as though it was dead. A Yao, a pond. They confronted each other like this. Time slipped away. Pu Yao suddenly took back the leg he had stepped with, his expression returning to normal. A kind of disdain was at the corner of his mouth. "Stars in daylight, hey, do you really think this is still 3,000 years ago? You made it too big." He was somewhat rejoicing at the calamity. The black water pond wasn't affected. Pu Yao shrugged, "So what if it stars in daylight? Can it extinguish Sky Yao fire?" "The Sky Yao fire even you can't extinguish." The black water pond suddenly started to flip as though it was boiling. Explosive sounds came out of the inky black water. Pu Yao raised his head to look at the sky and lightly said a sentence that instantly made the pond water quiet. "Oh, it seems everyone wants to see." In the blink of an eye, the pond regained its clarity. The obedient waterfall resumed its ferocity and roared, the water splashing. Pu Yao gave a light laugh and disappeared. An extremely strong consciousness scanned over Cold Mist Valley. When Zhuemo opened his eyes, he instantly shuddered. So cold. The coldness of the water told him where he was situated. The cold pond of Cold Mist Valley. Last time, it had been here where he had broken through to one breath. He was very familiar with this situation. But after he had achieved one breath, he had never felt suffocated in the water. In the past, Zhuemo had actually been suspicious that he might turn into a fish. Ouch! Zhuemo bared his teeth. So painful. Any movement and a heart-wrenching pain would come from all over his body. His features instantly twisted. Thankfully, he wasn't dead. What he could remember up until was when that hazy voice told him to eat the fire dragon grass. What happened after, he didn't know at all. But right now, he wasn't willing to think, too lazy to move, his entire body was hurting and very quickly, he found he wasn't wearing a scrap of clothing. How would he get out? He wanted to laugh but couldn't. Right now, he didn't want to think about anything. He just wanted to go to sleep. But the pond water was really too cold, so cold it reached his heart. This wasn't a good place to sleep. Why was it that every time, he would torment himself so much? Forcing himself alert, he gritted his teeth and entered meditation. He wanted to know what his situation really was like. The Ling energy in his body abruptly appeared in front of him. He was first struck dumb and then was overjoyed. Zuji. He had completed Juji. Internal vision, this was internal vision. In a trance, he saw the three-dimensional diagram of the Ling energy moving through his body. Each strand of Ling energy was so clear for him to see. He felt as though he could see all objects, his mind becoming clear. Suemo didn't know how long it was until his thoughts refocused. He hurriedly inspected his Ling energy again and to his surprise, he found his Ling energy was 3 times what it had been originally been. No wonder the distance between the 10th level of Lianqi and Juji was a great canyon. It really was a canyon. He had just entered Juji and his cultivation had increased 3 times. Think of the power disparity. It might have been caused by excess happiness, but the pain from his body seemed to lessen greatly. Suemo struggled out of the bottom of the pond and floated towards the top. When his head came out of the water, he couldn't help sucking in a breath. He hadn't thought that he would really make it through the fire dragon grass. Even now, he was still somewhat in disbelief. Fire dragon grass was something that only terrifying and abnormal people like Shixiang could endure. But he actually made it through. But he still had lingering fears. The danger involved could be deduced from the pain of his entire body. But, he finally made it through. He opened his mouth and wanted to laugh but found that his throat was dry and painful, unable to make a sound. His hands pushed against the side of the pond, trying to climb out. His body shuddered in great pain and almost made him faint. With no other solution, he could only use his hands to grab a rock beside the pond, his body soaking in the water. The joy after surviving a calamity made everything seem so beautiful. After a long time, the pain lessened slightly and his strength had slightly recovered. Struggling to climb out of the pond, he found the jade scrolls and other times scattered on the ground. He carefully picked them all up. What really made him feel pain was that 3rd-grade spirit traveling seal. It had burnt down to only a small scrap. Did his body really combust? He still remembered the strong feeling of burning before he became unconscious, but that was all he remembered. Thankfully, most of his belongings, like talismans and jade sticks, were still undamaged. But since the spirit traveling seal was gone, and he was naked, how would he get back to West Wind Valley? Suddenly, he had an idea. Casting, Little Art of Cloud and Rain, he saw a white ball of clouds appear in front of him. He snickered, his hands maintaining the spell as his body sneaked into the cloud. Oh, cold, very comfortable. Very quickly, he found that the pain in his body seemed to have lessened slightly. Did Little Art of Cloud and Rain have healing properties? But this wasn't the time to study it. He should think of a way to get back. Old Black had finished his work in the fields and was preparing to return home. Walking on the road, he couldn't help but ponder what he had just seen. Thinking about it now, he felt his heart tremble. Stars appearing during daytime. There were many strange things in the world, natural abnormalities. Was this a bad omen? He couldn't help but raise his head. In the blue sky, other than the sun, there was nothing else. Old Black exhaled. Normal was good, normal was good. Normality was the best. Please don't have any change. As he thought aimlessly, he walked back towards his residence. Where he was living now was the big yard that Suemo had lived in previously. Detecting that someone was coming opposite him, he raised his head. At a glance, he was pinned to the ground, his expression dumbstruck. After a pause, he recovered and stammered, "Little Moge, you are," as Mo was completely shrouded in a white cloud. Only his head was left sticking out. Looking down, Old Black could barely make out a pair of bare feet. Old Black felt this white cloud seemed familiar. He suddenly realized, wasn't this the cloud from Little Art of Cloud and Rain? Was he taking a bath? Thinking about the rain of Little Art of Cloud and Rain, Old Black felt that this creativity was pretty good. But, he didn't need to bathe on the mountain road, and wash as he kept on walking. Zhuemo was extremely embarrassed and wanted to find a crack in the ground to hide himself. But due to his zombie face, there wasn't any bashfulness, no embarrassment. He seemed very at ease. His entire body was in pain. Any movement, and the pain would pierce his heart. He could only laboriously move his feet step by step. Old Black decided to give a compliment. He reached out with his thumb, "Little Moge, this trick is great." Zhuemo felt that there weren't any words that could describe his feelings right now. He could only nod his head solemnly in acknowledgement and then slowly walk down the path. Looking at the back of the white ball slowly moving, even Old Black couldn't help but feel that little Moge's bearing had really improved. What made Zhuemo feel hopeless was that he had encountered quite a few outer sect disciples as he made his way. Their strange gazes made Zhuemo's hair stand up. When he reached West Wind Valley, he almost wept tears of joy. But when he appeared at the gates of his own little yard, the gray-beaked goose at the rooftop was suddenly alarmed and quickly used its wings to cover its eyes. Zhuemo's heart instantly shattered into countless pieces, landing on the ground. So this gray bird was female. What made Zhuemo feel depressed was that this female bird sneakily created a small opening through her wings and peeped through from behind. And what made his teeth itch even more was that this female bird's gaze turned from curious to disdainful. Damned bird! Humiliated, Zhuemo angrily sent out a sword energy. Honk! The gray-beaked goose shouted in alarm and nimbly dodged. It flew into the air and then suddenly extended its neck, full of disdain as it spat at the ground. Zhuemo almost fainted in anger. He threw out hatefully, "You are a dead bird, just wait." What he was thankful for was that he hadn't encountered an elder on his way. If Master saw his state, she would beat him halfway to death and throw him down the mountain to feed the dogs. Laboriously moving into the room, he collapsed on the bed. He didn't want to move, he didn't want to think, didn't want to move a fingertip. He was exhausted. Very quickly, he slipped into a deep sleep. Before sleeping, he lightly muttered, "Juji." Chapter 47 Shixiang Sui. Waking up, Zhuemo almost couldn't open his eyes in the bright sunlight. He gave a comfortable groan. The soreness made his entire body feel relaxed. He wanted to keep sleeping. After struggling for a moment, he still decided to get up. In Juji, there really wasn't any need for sleep. But other than to recover strength, sleep's most important purpose was to let the mind rest. In the sunlight, he stretched out his spine, his entire skeleton cracking like popcorn. Zhuemo instantly was frightened and quickly inspected his body. Not finding any problems, his heart was then reassured. He always felt that he muddled through all his breakthroughs. He never had the knowledge of what happened. Like, Little Art of Cloud and Rain, going to the 4th level, embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, breaking into one breath, it was all like this. This time wasn't an exception. Other than these crisp sounds, and the increase in cultivation, he had not found any other benefits that Juji had brought. He was too greedy. Zhuemo laughed at himself. Just in the increase in cultivation was enough for him to receive countless benefits. Walking out of the room, Zhuemo, after the calamity, felt that the warm sunlight was all the more precious. Even the damn bird on the rooftop wasn't as terrible in his eyes as yesterday. Suddenly stopping, he took a deep breath. The slightly spread 10 fingers suddenly moved, creating an afterimage. His gaze was focused, his 10 fingers coming alive, darting quickly. The complicated transformations would dazzle a person's eyes. After learning Art of Flora, a spell that prioritized finger movements, this almost became one of his most practiced spells. There wasn't too many spells to practice in Lianqi involving manipulation of Ling energy. Like Little Art of Cloud and Rain, Zhuemo had almost practiced it to the limits of what a Lianqi cultivator could do. And how to use spiritual power, he didn't have one word of instruction, and couldn't even touch the doorway. The only thing that time could be spent upon, and that he felt useful, were finger movements. Therefore, Art of Flora, that used finger movements was his only choice. The increase in cultivation didn't cause an evident increase in the finger movements. This point raised Suomo's attention. Zhuji was only the first stage in the journey of cultivation. The dangers of the road ahead, only trying it personally could lead to understanding. His goal, from a long time ago, it wasn't earning Jingshi or just living anymore. To search for the answer, then what was required was sufficient strength. Even Master, a Jin Dan, was cautious when speaking of the guy that had changed his features and erased his mind. How powerful the other's power must be. In other words, at the least, he needed power that surpassed his master. Master was a Jin Dan. Suomo took a deep breath, raised his expressionless face, and the hands that had been at his side silently turned to fists. It was very far, far enough to make him feel it was impossible. There were countless cultivators, how many would become Jin Dan? To say of nothing else, but in the second generation of the entire sect, the only one that had hopes of becoming Jin Dan was Wei Xingxixiao. Himself? A guy that only had some talent in the area of 5 elements. If it was becoming a strong ling plant farmer, Suomo didn't have any doubts of whether he could achieve it. But achieving Jin Dan, his most optimistic prediction was only just a hope of 1 in 10,000. After he learned of his changed features and erased mind, he had continuously asked himself, was it really worth it to pursue after such an illusory and distant goal? Right now, as a ling plant farmer, his life would become better and better. If he formed a relationship with someone, his own descendants would have a pretty good life. But this, gambling his living, his life, to pursue that goal that had almost no chance of winning, was it worth it? Whenever he started to sway, he would always think of that dream that frequently appeared, that kept on repeating, even in death, you must not forget. Every time he would ask himself, what was it that he could not forget even if he died? He didn't know. He was a cowardly person. In order to live, he could flatter, could bow his spine, but he wanted to know. The change in his frame of mind caused the change in his attitude to his cultivation to change completely. He worked more, worked harder. He knew just how low his starting point was. He also knew that his own innate talents were not good. But he also knew he had his own advantages. Pooh, even though he had cursed this damned perverse Renyao countless times, but Suomo still needed to thank him. Without Pu Yao, he couldn't even see a hint of sunlight. For this sliver of light, even if he had to pay some things, he was still willing. This time, Zhuji had been a painful ordeal for him. But for some reason, his mental state became calmer, his thoughts clearer. Being a ling plant farmer could dramatically increase his position in the sect, but clearly, a ling plant farmer could not help him complete his goal. What he could rely on in this area was still sword scriptures. Ling plant farming, in the future, it was an important technique to earn Jingshi but not his main path of development. There were many paths to increase attack power, but of the many types of cultivation, the one with strongest attack power were sword cultivators. Even more, he was situated in a sword sect and naturally wouldn't abandon what was near to reach for the far. He might not have much talent with the sword, but he just needed to work harder. Thinking about sword cultivation, he remembered that after Zhuji, he could imprint a flying sword. Very quickly, he ran into difficulties. He didn't have a scripture for imprinting a flying sword. In Fragrant Ginger Yard, Shi Fengrong was shocked when she saw Suomo but instantly recovered. Even with Zhuji, you cannot be lazy. Go to the records room. You will be able to read some of the jade sticks. Coming out next time, I will personally test you. If you were lazy, there will be a heavy punishment. The last few words were extremely threatening. Suomo cowered under Master's scolding, and could only murmur in affirmation. Inside, he wailed at his misfortune. It seemed he had hit Master's sore point somehow and couldn't help but wonder who had irritated Master. Only when Master's anger had decreased some did he cautiously open. Master, this disciple wants to request a scripture for impressing a flying sword. Impressing a flying sword? Shi Feng Rong couldn't help but frown and said with some dissatisfaction, your priority should be ling farming and dan making. Don't be greedy. Too greedy and you cannot digest it all. Don't you understand that? Sui Mo heard this and grimaced. He just knew he wouldn't receive a good scripture. His mouth went, this disciple understands. But our Wukong sect is a sword sect. If this disciple doesn't know how to even impress a flying sword, walking out, wouldn't it shame the sect? That's true. Hearing this, Shi Feng Rong thought it was reasonable. You can go see your Shixiang Su Yi and find a scripture to practice. Do not spend too much effort. Yes. Sui Mo agreed docilely. Go. Shi Feng Rong discourteously sent him away. The stars in daytime that had appeared yesterday caused his mood to be bad to the extreme. She had heard some of the rumors about stars in daytime. There were all kinds of strange ones, but one point was unusually unanimous. That was, it wasn't a good thing. If this kind of incident had happened in one of the other Jia, she could go spectate, but since it happened in Tianyu Jia, her mood became bad. Especially when she saw the worry in her sect leader Shixiang's eyes, her mood became worse. She knew sect leader Shixiang very well. Sect leader Shixiang never was panicked. Since even he was worried this time, the situation probably was worse than she had imagined. If this lady knew who was the one behind all this, humph humph. Murderous intent flashed through her eyes, causing Su Qing at the side to jump in fright. Even as he left Fragrant Ginger Yard, Sui Mo felt that his chest was heavy. He knew that Master was looking out for him, but he could not tell his reasons to Master. It seemed that he had thought too simply. Sui Mo grimaced inside. Originally, he had assumed that if his contribution to the sect was large, the sect would naturally increase his benefits and he wouldn't have to worry about things like scriptures. Now he knew that he had expected too much. His benefits would naturally increase, but benefits were also sorted into areas. Things like spells were the very core of a sect. Would they easily give it to others? Right now, he could only hope for Wei Xing Shixiang to come out of the sword cave and teach him some moves. He still decided to take a trip to Su Yi Shixiang's place. He might not get a good spell, but he could seek a substitute. He'll take an average one. He had nothing in terms of sword scriptures. He was a page of white. Learning something would help his fundamentals. Humph, if the sect won't give, then he'll just buy it. If the jingsher that he threw out was numerous enough, he would naturally be able to buy a pretty good sword scripture. Gu is a ling plant farmer, am I someone that would lack for jingsher? He completely forgot that his last piece of jingsher had been extracted by Pu Yao. In the sea of consciousness, the sea of fire roared. If Sui Mo came in, he would certainly be in for a fright. The dancing deep red flames had grown a section higher. The temperature of the ice river seemed to have decreased. And the biggest change was the star in the sky. Bright as a diamond, magnificent and dazzling. On the gravestone shrouded in the black clouds, Pu Yao lazily used his hand to support his perfect and flawless chin, the other hand rubbing a pile of powder, muttering to himself, used up all the jingsher, ah. This guy is really a piece of trash, even getting a jingsher requires almost killing himself. He said to the air, if I knew earlier, I'd have gone myself. Now it's great, you made the incident big, so many powerful guys have arrived from outside. Even dead, you're still making trouble for me. It really is inflexible to the death. The white powder dribbled from the cracks in his hands. A lonely Yao sat on the gravestone and said ruefully, the landlord doesn't have any surplus either. In the Hall of Hearing Principles, Su Yi was slightly shocked when he saw Sui Mo but quickly recovered his composure. He smiled opening, it's a rare occasion for Shitty to come. Come, sit. Sui Mo looked at Su Yi Shixiang. The other was a person that he had admired very much when he had been an outer sect disciple. He had never thought that he could sit on equal ground with him now. The affairs of the world, it really was fickle. He couldn't help but sigh. Zuemo has to thank Shixiang for guidance in the past. He sincerely gave a bow. Sui blanked and then hurried to help Zuemo up. Shitty doesn't have to be so courteous. That was just my duty. After this exchange of words, both felt that they were much closer to each other. It's rare for Shitty to come, have a taste of my tea. Suyi's hands twisted, a set of tea equipment appeared in front of him. A yellow bamboo tea tray carved with 2 clouds. Simple and humble. On top was a purple clay teapot. The light flashed across the purple clay teapot, formations clearly were carved on it. 7 small cups like the 7 stars of the Northern Dipper. Sui took out a square jade box. When it was opened, Zuemo felt a fragrance spread towards him. The box was half full with ling tea. The ling tea was as green and bright as jade. It was a branch with 3 leaves clustered at the end, tender and glistening. This is fragrance tea. Sui introduced, produced by the Ivy Aromatic Shop. It took a lot of effort to buy this. Then he gave a smile. I don't have any other indulgences, just this one. Sui Shixiang's eyes were focused as his hands skillfully started to wash the pot and cups. When had Zuemo ever seen such things? His eyes widened, unblinking. He saw Sui Shixiang first take out a small amount of tea leaves to put into the purple clay pot, pour in cold spring water, and then the thumb and index finger of the right hand gently pinched. A red flame floated in front of him. The movements of Shixiang's long and white fingers were extremely gentle as he gently placed this red flame inside the purple clay pot. Hiss splat, hiss splat. Inside the purple clay pot, countless water droplets exploded. The spring water inside the pot became a ball of green mist, yet not a drop spilled. Sui Shixiang quickly lifted the teapot and a rush of green tea poured into the teacup. Inside the teacup, the tea soup was green and enticing. A fragrance completely different than the one before wafted out. Drink quickly, the effect wouldn't be as good if it's cold. Sui Shixiang's expression was solemn. He directly held up a cup and put it to his mouth. Copying Shixiang, Zuemo also picked up a cup. Mimicking Shixiang, whose expression was intoxicated as he sipped, he also took a drink. Boom! It was impossible to describe the feeling that occurred the instant the tea soup touched the tongue. It was as though countless flavors had gathered and exploded at once inside the mouth. At the same time, Zuemo's tears and snot streamed out. Seeing Zuemo's sorry state, Sui almost choked on a sip of tea and then grinned widely. Zuemo couldn't care about Shixiang's laughter. All of his attention was on pondering this strange feeling. A rush of coolness spread through his limbs, his body unspeakably light. All the pores seemed to have opened, so comfortable he could groan. This tea soup has dense ling energy. You just entered Juji, this is good to stabilize your level. Sui reminded. Hearing this, Zuemo hurriedly swallowed the remaining tea soup, got into lotus position and entered meditation. Looking at Zuemo's gulps, Sui Shixiang only shook his head, seemingly dissatisfied with Zuemo wasting such a good thing. With a small mouthful after another, a face full of pleasure, he slowly drank. When Zuemo woke up from mediation, he felt his body refreshed and unspeakably comfortable. He didn't waste words and raised his hands to Sui Shixiang. Many thanks, Shixiang. Sui waved his hand, just invited Shitty to drink tea. Coming this time, Shitty must have a matter. Zuemo narrated how he had requested a spell for impressing a flying sword from his master. Hearing this, Sui nodded, I understand. I hadn't thought that since Shitty had received the jade medal, you still want to cultivate the sword. I'm just playing around. Zuemo hurriedly replied. After being cracked down by master, he felt it was better not to say anything. A man wanting to improve the sword, it isn't something embarrassing. Wielding a sword in the world, kill Yao and exterminate Mo, it is amazing. Shi Xiang had been like this before, but later, found that my talents were average and hard to achieve anything, so turned to learning forging. Sui first laughed at himself and then said seriously, since Shidi is interested in the sword, Shi Xiang has spent some more time in the sect, so knows a bit more, and can chat about it with Shidi. When Zhuo Mo heard, kill Yao and exterminate Mo, he couldn't help but grimace bitterly inside. Thinking about the perverse Ren Yao, he felt it was more likely that he would be killed and exterminated. But he still said solemnly, thank you Shi Xiang. Chapter 48 The Black-Hearted Records Room. Our sect is a sword sect. Our strongest sword scripture is the Void Sword Scripture that our founder created. But our sect had gradually declined. This sword scripture that had been ranked 6th grade could not be learned by anyone in the sect. Somehow, after that, it was split into Shapeless Sword Scripture and Empty Sword Scripture. The one that Luo Li Shidi practices is Empty Sword Scripture. But these two scriptures that were split only reached 3rd grade. Other than this, the other one of importance is Master's Ice Dragon Sword Scripture. This sword scripture is a 4th grade sword scripture. In the hands of Master, it blossomed and managed to enter the ranks of 5th grade. In the past, it was with this sword scripture that Master had killed countless Yaoma in Yao Hunt and received the title of Ice Dragon Sword. As he talked about his master Xin Yen, Sui wandered away in his thoughts. A 4th grade sword scripture that was able to elevate into 5th grade, it was enough to show that Xin Yen Shishu's abilities with Ice Dragon Sword Scripture didn't just reach deeply, but that he had improved this sword scripture. No one who was able to do this was ordinary. Other than this, the ancestors of our sect were also skilled. Cloud Sword Scripture, Red Flame Sword Scripture, Emerald Sword Scripture, they are all 4th grade. Shidi, don't just think that our sect doesn't have any reputation in Dongfu. But in Dongfu, other than Dongfu Hall, only we have a 6th grade sword scripture. Even 4th grade scriptures, not just any sect in Dongfu has one. Zhuo Mo's eyes widened. He had never thought that the sect was so strong. Sui noticed Zhuo Mo's eyes and smiled, Shidi, don't think too optimistically. Sword scriptures above 4th level, the sect wouldn't easily pass it on to the disciples. What the sect leader and the Shishu believe is better to have nothing than accept a shoddy choice. In the past, Luo Li Shidi was unparalleled in the 2nd generation, but even so, he was only passed on the 3rd grade sword scripture, Empty Sword Scripture. Seeing the disappointment in Zhuo Mo's eyes, he comforted, Shidi, don't be too disappointed. There are very fine ones among the 3rd grade sword scriptures. Like the Empty Sword Scripture that Luo Li Shidi learnt, and that Shapeless Sword Scripture that also came from Void Sword Scripture, they are the extreme best among 3rd grade sword sections. Shidi, you have to pay attention. They might all be 3rd grade sword scriptures, but there are still differences. Zhuo Mo instantly raised his ears. It was too hard to pursue those good ones, but he shouldn't pick the worst ones. He was very practical. The item less a bit, but the Jingshi difference wouldn't just be a bit. Usually, 5 elements sword scriptures are the worst. Shidi is a ling plant farmer and your understanding of the 5 elements definitely is deeper than mine. The 5 elements encompass millions of changes yet lose their purity. To cultivate the sword, what cannot be lost is purity. But the 5 elements birth and defeat each other, and are difficult to make pure. I had never heard of a 5 elements sword scripture that went above 3rd grade. Shidi, don't try to pick this kind of sword scripture. The other sword scriptures, they all have their attributes. Some are fierce and powerful, good for killing and battle, some are strange and unpredictable, good for ambushing, some nurture the mind and increase cultivation. Nurture the mind? Aren't sword scriptures primarily for killing? How can it nurture the mind? Zhuo Mo couldn't help asking. Haha, cultivation is long and difficult. If there isn't a strong and resolute heart, how can one achieve the path? To use the sword to nurture the heart, to harden the core. Many people practice this kind of sword scripture. Like me, I have, Heaven Heart Sword Scripture. This kind of sword scripture, it doesn't have much power but to nurture and fix the mind, it's pretty good. Su-yi smiled as he explained. The sect records at Riverside Peak. You are an inner sect disciple now and can go in to read. But it requires contribution points each time. If Shitty has spare time, remember to earn more sect contribution points. In the future, you'll need to use them. Su-yi emphasized. Bidding farewell to Su-yi Shixiang, Suemo headed straight for Riverside Peak. There was a river below Riverside Peak, the mountain was steep and so the records room was built against the cliff. It wasn't big, just a small compound. There were some thin bamboo stalks planted beside the walls, the outer wall slightly crumbling. Suemo was somewhat disappointed. He had never been here before. This place was only open to inner sect disciples. The person guarding the door was an old one. At the beginning, Suemo fantasized that the other was some high master but he was quickly disappointed. This old man guarding the door only had a cultivation of Lianqi 9th level. However, Suemo didn't dare to disrespect him. The common saying was good, the existing official wasn't as good as the existing manager. Don't just look at how bad the old man's cultivation was but he guarded the records room. If he wanted to make trouble, it was a very easy thing to do. Respectfully handing over his medal, the old man scanned it and lowered down his face, saying, 2 hours on the first level is 2 contribution points, 2 hours on the second floor is 4 contribution points. The jade scrolls in the first level can be copied. The second level is restricted from copying. Go in. He threw the medal back to Suemo. So black. Suemo swore inside. The contribution points of inner sect disciples were not the same as outer sect disciples and they could not be converted. Suemo only had in total 10 contribution points. 5 of them had been the reward the sect leader gave him for receiving the jade medal. The other 5 were from last time when he let Yen Lushirshu sell his plants. 10 contribution points. It was enough for him to stay 10 hours on the first floor and 5 on the second. If it was copying a jade scroll, even the most basic would be 2 or so hours. And if it couldn't be copied then it had to be memorized. That wasn't something that could be accomplished in a few hours. Now he understood why Su-yi Shixiang reminded him to earn more contribution points. So the big cost was here. He was suddenly grateful that the Dan-making records room of his master didn't require contribution points. Otherwise, he could only cry. Suemo guessed that Xian Yen Shirshu definitely would have a private forging records room. Otherwise, Su-yi Shixiang would be in a terrible bind. Time was tight, and didn't allow Suemo to think. He ran straight into the first floor. He saw rows of jade scrolls, organized neatly. Suemo couldn't help twist his mouth. From what he saw, this was much worse than Master's records room. A layer of dust had accumulated on the wooden boards. It looked like there usually weren't many people. Even though it lacked care, but the arrangement of the jade scrolls was easy to follow. There were all kinds of jade scrolls. Sword scriptures, 5 elements, cultivation scriptures, forging. These were the jade scrolls that the elders of the sect that searched and gathered over the generations. The grade of these jade scrolls weren't high, didn't have much practical value but it would have been a pity to throw them out so the sect had created a records room to support the inner sect members to study. This kind of jade scrolls were only useful to those who had just become an inner sect disciple. As they spent longer with their master, the worth of these jade scrolls would decrease. It had been a long time since Wukong's sword sect had new inner sect disciples come in. After Li Yingfeng became an inner sect disciple, she spent each day with Yen Lushirshu taking care of all the different business. And after Wei Xing Shixiang became an inner sect disciple, he received Xi and Yan Shishu's meticulous teachings and then entered the sword cave, therefore, he naturally didn't come here. So when Zhuo came in, he saw this dusty scene. Even though there wasn't high-level spells, but the roomful of jade scrolls still made Zhuo's eyes turn dizzy and drool. Don't just think that these jade scrolls weren't important. If they were thrown onto the market, each one could be sold for a pretty good price. For Lianqi disciples, each jade scroll would be a treasure. Zhuo headed straight for the sword scriptures. It was also the largest topic on the first floor. Wukong's sword sect was a sword sect, so naturally, it would put all possible effort into gathering sword scriptures. There were large numbers of second and third grade sword scriptures on the first floor. Naturally, they weren't of high quality. After making a cursory examination, he quickly put them down. As expected, there was nothing really good. It wasn't bad as a reference, but for a primary method, it wasn't really good. Looking at the stars for the second floor, he hesitated a second and then decided to go up to see. The second floor was slightly smaller and there was a dramatically smaller number of jade scroll. But the scene was very similar to Master's Records room. The jade scrolls were all floating in midair, each jade scroll surrounded by differently colored whirlpools. Having had a similar experience, Zhuo naturally knew what to do. He scanned through the jade scrolls about sword scriptures one by one. Even now, he still hadn't decided what kind of sword scripture to cultivate. If it had been before, he might have chosen to be like Su Yi Shixiang and practice something like Sky Heart sword scripture. This kind of sword scripture cultivated the resolve of the cultivator, something that was crucial. However, for him that was pursuing strength, finding those sword scriptures that had greater power was more realistic. Undecided, Zhuo flipped and read through them one by one. He had never seen so many jade scrolls at the same time. The jade scrolls from the second level, if it had been in the past, they would all have been treasures that he would have dreamed about. He couldn't help but feel as though he was in a dream. As expected, the sword scriptures that Su Yi Shixiang had mentioned were all absent. The second floor were entirely third-grade sword scriptures but were distinctively of higher quality than the jade scrolls downstairs. They should be the finest of the third grade. There was a set of wind and thunder sword scripture. After cultivating it, one would float like the wind, power like thunder, the effectiveness shocking. Supposedly it had originally been a fifth-grade sword scripture, but after continuous loss over thousands of years, its power declined and it was demoted to third grade. And another even stranger was, Autumn Rain sword scripture. It required a set of 108 swords. The moves were like rain, extremely difficult to block. But just like Wind and Thunder sword scripture, much of its contents had been lost, especially the method of making the swords. The power of each individual sword dropped dramatically and it entered an awkward state. But its manipulations were very exquisite, so it was put on the second floor. Each sword scripture had its unique strengths, but similarly, they all had a great flaw. Seeing that the jade scrolls he hadn't read become less and less, Zhuo started to become panicked. Was he unable to find an appropriate sword scripture for himself? He completely forgot that time was flowing away. As the number of the jade scrolls decreased one by one, his heart started to sink to the bottom bit by bit. At last, he was facing the last jade scroll. Li Water sword scripture. Li Water, these two characters clearly connected to the five elements caused Zhuo's heart to jump. Su Yi Shixiang's words were by his ears. Shixiang had kept reminding him of the weak nature of five-element sword scriptures. Zhuo, who had a rough understanding of the five elements, was very clear just how correct Shixiang was. The five elements had many transformations, but it was hard to purify. If the sword essence was not pure, then the power would decrease. Completely disheartened, Zhuo unconsciously read Li Water sword scripture. He suddenly found something and his mind roused itself. Just as he wanted to take a closer look, his eyes suddenly flashed and then he found himself standing in the yard. Time has ended. You have used all your contribution points. The old man's eyelids didn't even raise as he gave a dismissal. Zhuomo wanted to cry. You're tuning into the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.